We're in the thick of it, guys. We are knocking out some of the smaller chapters. The syllabus is new this year, if I didn't already tell you that. So I'm getting used to the order of things. It's the same content, they just shuffled some things around. And I'm trying to follow it for the most part because I think that's easier for you guys to study. You can just kind of make your way front to back in the syllabus and see, yep, we did that, we did that. So that's what's going on my end. Let's see here. Okay. So let's pick up where we left off last week, do a little bit of review, and then we'll just kind of proceed. I'll touch base back with the syllabus again. Make sure you're on the same page there. And we left off with land use controls. We had spent a lot of time on public land use controls. We just got into the private ones, although we did kind of talk about that at the beginning of our time. But the difference is what? Who enforces the following of public land use controls? Who's going to be in charge of making sure people use the property with the proper zoning use or build structures according to proper building code? Who is the enforcer in that situation? For public land use controls like building code, subdivision regulations, zoning laws, making sure that all those things are followed properly.
County officials.
Yeah, that's it. The government, right? Some inspector from the government, the zoning board in the case of a zoning situation. It's the government's police powers. That doesn't mean a police car shows up. It means the government has this power of authority to send you the letter and say, hey, you're not complying properly with the zoning that your house is allowing the use of. That's terrible English, but we have a problem. If you don't fix this, you're going to start getting fined, right? You're going to get fined. There's a thing called what is it called? Impervious surface or and I got a letter. If you look at my property in the map view overhead, the Google Earth view, you can see from the satellite image, and it shows a couple of big moving trucks in the vacant lot to the side of my property. Well, I let some friends of mine who own a moving company park here, right? So the assumption might be that they're parking on asphalt or concrete like a driveway, but actually it's just a gravel lot. I didn't pave that lot. And so they've been parking there for years. And I got a letter from the city, right? The same city that sent me the letter about the no tag on my expedition sent me a letter about questioning whether I had too much impervious area on my property. Impervious means water can't get through it. What can water not go through? It can't go through concrete. It could soak in, but it's going to run off of it at a pretty high rate of speed, right? If you ever watch the rain come down your driveway compared to come onto your lawn, when it falls on your grass, it soaks right in. When it hits your concrete driveway, it runs off into the street. And so the runoff creates problems sometimes. Too much water running too fast can create erosion and just a huge flood of a river down your street if it's not controlled properly. So I get the concern. The concern is too much hard surfaces on a property creates a high speed of water runoff. So they sent me a letter. And when it says impervious area, that means area that water can't easily soak into and therefore create these fast water runoff situations. Well, they assumed that those trucks were parking on concrete, and therefore I might have had like an acre of impervious area, and they were going to fine me for it. They wanted to charge me because I guess that has to do with them having to take extra measures about the runoff control or something. But turns out, of course, it's not impervious. I didn't have to pay the fee, but all that stuff was city, right? It's government related. It was the government that sent me that. It wasn't a neighbor who was mad about what they thought I might have as impervious area and tried to sue me. What would a neighbor suing you be an example of? What kind of controls are they trying to enforce when the neighbor is suing you? It's not the government trying to fine you or send you a letter, a warning letter. It's just a common
Private land controls?
Yes, exactly right. That's the difference. That's for you in this test, in this class. That is the big difference between public and private land use controls. Who is implementing them? The government versus the developer who sold you the lot, right? And then who is enforcing them? The government versus anybody who could sue you over it, probably a neighbor, because they painted their door black like they were allowed to, and you tried to paint yours some kind of a crazy hot pink or something. And that's not allowed in the covenants and restrictions. And so they're trying to make you comply with the covenants and restrictions, and that requires two things. Two possibilities for the enforcement of a private land use control. One, turning you into the HOA, if you have one. But then remember we talked before that neighborhoods might not have HOAs, homeowner associations, to do this enforcement. And if they don't, you always have the option to sue. To make the person comply with the agreed upon covenants and restrictions. So don't forget that little piece too. Just because the neighborhood has no HOA, no homeowners association in charge. A lot of people like that. They don't want somebody telling them what to do, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no rules. CCRs, conditions, covenants, and restrictions. There might still be rules even if there's no HOA. And so that's a big responsibility for us as brokers. Though they want to buy in Happy Valley subdivision, we better go check and find out, does Happy Valley have rules? If it doesn't have an HOA, okay, great. But it might still have covenants and restriction rules. Big one. That's a big one in real life. It's a big one on the test. So it all comes back to us. We have a duty to discover and disclose. And the big thing we said last week, that three most important words in a broker's career in this job are disclose, disclose, disclose. Kind of a joke, right? Real, but a joke. So let's look at some more of what we talked about last week. We talked about the police powers. We talked about all the sorts of things that zoning could regulate. Zoning has something to say about the size of the lot. You, as a owner of land, might decide that you want to sell that land and you want the lot sizes to be bigger. You're so tired of the cookie cutter, tiny little lot neighborhoods. So you say, well, I'm going to sell my 50 acres to a developer, but it is with the condition that they have to make minimum lot sizes of an acre. None of this 1/10 of an acre stuff, right? And that's okay. You're allowed to do that as long as you can find a buyer willing to go along with that, a developer who agrees and is willing to still pay you for your 50 acres and be able to do what they want to do with it. The thing about a developer is they want to maximize profit. So it better mean something to them. They better have some sort of a vision for these 1 acre lots, some way to justify agreeing with you and making use of your property that way. And that might not be hard to do. What would a developer consider if they want to maybe buy your 50 acres, but with the condition that they have to make no less than 1 acre lots for all the houses? What are some of the things running through a developer's mind, do you think? How could they justify that? Such a larger lot size. You have no reason to know this, but just kind of flex your thinking a little bit. Think, if I were a developer, if I were a developer buying land from someone, and that land requirement was, can't carve this land up into smaller than 1 acre lot sizes, what are you going to do about the price point of those houses? Go ahead.
Is there some way to divide it in like parcels? I'm just throwing a guess out there.
Say again.
Like dividing into parcels, that lot, or just throwing a guess out there.
So let me just reframe the question. You're selling 50 acres to a developer, and the developer is trying to think, well, I can buy these 50 acres, but he's making me not carve them up into any smaller than 1 acre lots. I can't go half acre, I can't go quarter acre, and therefore build more and more houses. What is a developer going to do if they can only divide those 50 acres into a certain smaller number than they would really like to? Or a larger number, fewer lots that they can sell.
They'll raise the prices.
There you go. And that's kind of what's happening right now with the interest. That's not the reason, but with interest rates going up, with the supply and demand being so lopsided to be such an inferior amount of supply, there's not a lot of affordable housing anymore, whatever that is, right? There's just not a lot of choices that are in the ones and 200,000 range, right? So that neighborhood in this scenario we've presented, not going to be affordable housing, is it? It's not going to probably be below 800,000, if that. The developer's going to justify it by saying, look, you won't let me carve it up into smaller than 1 acre lots. Therefore, I've got to put a house on here that's going to bring me back a profit. So all those things is sort of a domino effect, right? And zoning starts it. Zoning says, what can you do with this lot? The zoning might allow half acre lots, but if the seller of the land says, nope, if you buy my lot, you have to build on 1 acre, no less than 1 acre, the more strict one wins. Remember, right? Even though the zoning says half acre is allowed, the covenants and restrictions might say 1 acre minimum for this one. Density has to do with how many houses or ideally people you could fit into an acre, for instance. So R10, 10 units per acre. R3, 3 units per acre, that idea. Zoning regulates setbacks, meaning how close to the property line can you build your house? If you want to maximize the size of your yard, and you may not care what it looks like and how it lays out. You've got your lot and the neighbor's lot to both sides of you. You might, so the neighbor's house is like right there in the middle, like a lot of times they are, but you want to have as big a yard as possible. So you have an idea that, well, shoot, how about I just cram my house back here in the corner, and then I've got all this space here. Wrong. Won't work, right? The zoning won't let you. The zoning probably has setbacks. The zoning says, no, you can't cram it all the way to the very edge. You've got to be within this dotted line, and it's probably a bigger setback than on the back line or maybe the front. So it'll end up so that you're built pretty much in line with the neighbors. So it all kind of looks uniform. How crazy would it look if you drove through a neighborhood and some of the houses were over here and some chose to be there and another one over here chose to be there? So zoning affects setback lines where you can put the improvements that are on your property. Building heights are affected.
Question.
Yeah, go for it.
Let's just say I had 100 acres that a builder wanted to purchase, and I'd agreed to sell it to him. Could I set as an individual my own restrictive covenants on that land?
Yes. As long as you're confident that they're going to still buy it. You'll get to a point where you might not be able to find very many developer builder buyers for your property if you put too strict of a rule or a lot of rules in place. But yeah, if you're so determined that you want the minimum square footage, minimum acreage, whatever is important to you, as long as you're confident that, hey, I don't care who doesn't want to buy it, I'm only going to sell it to somebody that's willing to agree with these rules. That's exactly the point.
Well, let me ask you this. Why would a person set these rules on land that they're selling to someone else? It's like, why do they care what happens to it
Good
anymore?
point. You tell me. Why would you care? What would be so important to you that you would care? Is it, or anything? Or is it maybe, I don't really care at all. I'm going to be gone. Profit is the king. I'll just care about the money. And that's okay too.
Well, that's where I was at with it. I've been trying to think of something that I could come up with that would, I could say is some type of restrictive covenant, but there's nothing that I can personally think of because, after I sell it, I don't want anything else to do with it. Pretty much,
I get it. And that's probably the case most of the time, actually, Alfred. For the most part, I doubt very many people care. But let's say maybe it's somebody who's really sensitive about the environment, about nature, and maybe they grew up in the city, like in a very congested inner city environment, and they just like greenery. They like trees, and they're like, I don't want this to turn into that. So let me put some rules in place so it never becomes too congested around here. Maybe they grew up in a condo townhouse community where everybody is so super close. You can reach out, stretch your arm out and touch the neighbor. That's the kind of reason that I would imagine in real life they might be motivated to make such rules. Might be a certain amount or percentage of natural area. Might even be that. It could be that, let's see, family land. I know somebody that owns a real estate company, and if you're familiar with Concord at all, near Charlotte, near the Concord Mills Mall is a neighborhood called Christenberry, and she's actually a maiden name is Christenberry. So they sold that land back when I worked with them at their firm, and so it might be special to them that the land is no smaller than, or has some certain aesthetics or some sort of it might be an emotional reason, right? There's a house that just went under contract around the corner, not there, but around the other side of town. And it's like 100 and some years old, maybe almost 200 years old. I believe they estimated it to be around 1885. And so maybe a person who owns that property but wants to sell it to a developer, which they did. They sold it to Niblock Builders, and they quite possibly would say, yeah, I'm going to sell it to you, but you have to leave this historic home in place. And so that sort of reason, right? It's probably an emotional reason or some sort of a past experience, and they just want to fix something and not add to what they think is a negative in life or in the look of neighborhoods. But at the end of the day, money's money. And if they had trouble selling it and finding a developer or builder who bought into that idea of minimum 2-acre lots, for instance, they'd probably change their mind. They probably are not going to keep it forever. They'd say, well, okay, maybe that was too ambitious. Maybe we'll require at least a 1/2-acre lot, because you might not get a very good offer unless you can take some of those rules off of there. But you make a great point. Yeah. We talked about some specific types of zoning. A buffer zone is when we have some area between two differently used areas, like land separating residential versus commercial. You don't want to just walk out your front door and be right there in line of the dumpsters behind the Walmart, right? You want to have some buffer in between. Or cluster zoning being one of those multi-use planned unit developments where they've got some townhouses over here and some single family over there, and maybe a school and a retirement community. This extraterritorial jurisdiction concept means that the local city or municipality or town has authority even beyond its own borders. It has authority called extraterritorial jurisdiction to regulate the use within 1 to 3 miles of its borderlines, because that could still hurt or that could still harm them, right? Because they want to have some leeway, I guess you could say, to make sure that the zoning does not of something outside their lines doesn't negatively impact them. Things that could negatively impact residential zoning. Tell me some examples of what sort of other zoning or use of land might harm the sellability of a neighborhood. The neighborhood is too close to what sorts of things?
Historic zoning.
Okay. What else?
Like a landfill, waste management
There
facilities,
you go.
highway, airport.
Noise nuisances, smell nuisances, yep, sight nuisances. That's the common theme here, right? Things that are negative. There's an asphalt plant about 2 or 3 miles from my house. I don't smell it. I don't see it. They did a good job screening it. I can't see it from my house, but if I drive up the street and to the left, go about half a mile, there it is. And once upon a time, there was talk that my neighbor at the end of my road was considering selling to them. And I was nervous because that would have changed everything. Then the trucks driving back and forth across my road, on my road in front of my house, would have been those big dump trucks hauling that stinky asphalt just all day nonstop, right? Ended up having a church, a daycare, and a school down there instead of that. So I was pretty relieved. And it's a no outlet dead end road. So they go down, they have to come back. So it's a little more important to have decent neighbors like that than somebody that just drives by and just keeps going. It doesn't have to come back the way they came. Let's see. Zoning has to be fair. It's about the public good. Goes back to eminent domain and that concept. The government could take over your property, but they have to pay you for it, but only if it's for the public good. Zoning laws can't violate any one particular person. They have to be very specific. They can't discriminate. They have to apply to everybody equally. But you could have some non-conforming uses. You could have some people like me. I'm living here residentially, and everything around me is church, school, daycare, factory, warehouse. There's a collision repair center up the road, but I'm allowed to. It's illegal for me to be here right now because I'm in an illegal non-conforming use. You might hear the term grandfathered in. I'm using it because I'm grandfathered in to use it residentially because I was here before the zoning changed to what it is now. But eventually it's going to have to be conforming because I can't just be here forever. I can't build, if I won the lottery, I couldn't just build a 10,000 square foot house up on the hill because I'm in here as a legal non-conforming use. I can't fix it if it were to burn down because I'm here just for this limited use, this non-conforming use. So eventually it's going to make its way toward being used in the proper allowable use. Other words here, I could ask for a variance if I felt like I have an undue hardship, that I'm not allowed to use it in a certain way because of the zoning rules, and therefore please give me a variance because it's hurting me to have to use it this way. I think we gave the example of like a property owner getting an eminent domain loss of their front yard, and now they are not in compliance with the setback line, so they could maybe get a variance to not be within the allowable setback lines because it wasn't their fault about the eminent domain situation that took half of their yard. Hit that button again. Here we go. All right. So what else? There we go. Special use, allowing a property to be used for in a way that doesn't comply. Also, again, that'd be up to the zoning board. There's a board of people who meet regularly, and they take these requests under consideration and vote on them. Overlay districts, a good example of that is the historic district. There might be overlays for other aesthetic reasons. Everything in this neighborhood needs to look contemporary, something like that, some sort of a requirement there. Or in the city, like the uptown area, can't have buildings over a certain number of feet tall in this certain area that overlooks the park. I believe in New York City might very well be some zoning requirements about disrupting sight lines of Central Park for some of the buildings that surround it. Spot zoning is the bad one. Not allowed, illegal, because it's benefiting somebody for their own good, right? Just them, not the good of the public. Inconsistent with the public's good. We talked about subdivision regulations, the fact that to have to be required by the government to adhere to subdivision regulations is dependent on if it is a subdivision. And what makes it a subdivision? Carving it up into a certain number of lots. What's that magic number? You divide your land into even just 2 lots, and now it's got to comply with the subdivision ordinances as to how to divide property. If it's in the city limits of Concord, for instance, for commercial reasons, you're going to have to budget into your project sidewalks and certain way that's curb and gutter looks according to certain size. It can't just be any old dimension. It can't be a 1 foot wide sidewalk, right? It's got to be a very specific set of criteria. And all that falls under how can a developer develop a subdivision? The other part of this is a developer can sell the lots in a subdivision even if they only have a preliminary plan, but they can't close on that sale yet until that preliminary plan has become a final plat approval and has been recorded. That's when they can close. But they do it all the time. They sell, go under contract with preliminary plat approval. They just know that, okay, it's going to take us 6 or maybe 9 months to build this house. So by then we'll have the plat approved, right? Or this whole phase, we're going to sell this entire phase of 20 houses. By the time we get those houses built, ready to close, we should have final plat approval. And if they didn't, for some reason, the plat approval, the final plats were not able to be approved around the time all those houses got finished, guess what? We're not having any closings yet, right? They can't close. They'd have to wait to close until the final plat map got approved and recorded. That caused for some pretty frustrated homeowners or potential homeowners, but so the timing needs to be right because it's a criminal act if they close on lots that are in unapproved subdivisions or subdivisions not following these rules and laws. The other big one is whether the streets are publicly maintained or not. And the big 3 that you're looking for is must be built to the Department of Transportation standards. Got to build the right width of street and the right quality of construction. Also, ask the DOT, can you please take this over as publicly maintained so we don't have to have private maintenance agreements. And then finally, it's not automatic. The DOT might not approve it. So the third step is that hoping that the DOT says, yes, okay, we'll accept this. Now it is publicly maintained and you don't have to budget in for every few years to have to fix potholes and repave the street. The neighbors everybody on that street would have to, they wouldn't have to, but if they didn't have some sort of a private street maintenance agreement, then the street's just going to get worse and worse with nobody paying for it. Or maybe only 2 out of the 20 paying for it, the ones who care the most. So, and anybody who buys a house on a privately maintained street might have this affect their values, might affect their property value eventually. And for us as brokers, we would never want to sell property to somebody who didn't know that the street was private, not public. Because when it does come up to them and they're faced with having to pay $20,000 to make some repairs or maybe repave, they're going to come calling. They're going to say, hey, you didn't tell me this was private, not public. So you're going to have to pay this for me. And there's when the lawsuits and the complaints to the commission come in. We talked about building codes along the way of building something, whether it's an improvement, a room onto your house or an entire property, entire building, has to be built to minimum code requirements. Certain insulation standards, what the R value of the insulation has to be at minimum, the structural standards, is it able to support the weight and size of the roof, and how big of an interior open space can there be without pillars or beams that kind of get in the way. All that stuff are some basic building code requirements that are checked by a city inspector, for instance, who comes out throughout the process as the different phases of construction are done. Someone's coming out and checking that the building code for that phase was followed. If it all goes well and you fix all the issues that come up along the way, you get to the point as a developer or builder where you can start closing on the property, but that comes when you get a CO for the property, a CO for the house. Now it's deemed safe, built to a certain minimum standard of safety of the building code, and the CO is the certificate of occupancy. So if the test question said, what document from the city building inspector do you have to wait for in order to close on a new construction house? The answer would be the certificate of occupancy. All the inspections are done. It's safe to move in. So as brokers, when we go list a house and we see that they did work, they added something structural, for instance, our first question should be, oh, did you get a permit for that? In other words, did you have the city send somebody out and make sure you built it right, or whoever you hired built it right? Because if you didn't get a permit to build this improvement and get it approved, then what? We need to tell everybody. As brokers, we need to disclose it. It might be that they have trouble, the buyer has trouble getting a home loan if the house or significant room in the house or something doesn't have a permit. It might come out during the appraisal that there wasn't a permit. The appraiser notices that there's an entire wing of the house that was added and it looks like it was added later, and they check. All you have to do to find out if you had a permit, you could, if you drive by your neighbor's house and you see that they're doing work and you're curious and you just want to be nosy, you could call the local building inspector of the area and say, hey, did the owner there get a permit to build this new thing? Or tell me the last permits that were issued for this property. Give them the address and they'll tell you. It's not private information. I met an inspector, I had an inspection on a house that I was helping a buyer purchase. And there was some repair issues we were trying to negotiate. So I met a contractor at the property to look at those issues. And as we walked around it, he said, this garage looks kind of weird. The steps down from the house to the garage were not as deep as he thought they should be. And he said, I wonder if they built this garage to code. I did know that they had built the garage 3 months earlier. And he just pulled out his phone, and because he's a contractor, he had its speed dial set into his phone. And within 2 minutes, the lady at the building inspection office said, hey, could you tell me if there were any permits pulled for a property at ABC Street, 123 ABC Street? She said, click, click, click on her keyboard. And she said, oh yeah, there was one pulled 3 months ago to build a garage. So it's as easy as that. And a lot of what we need to discover and disclose when it comes to government permits and things is just a matter of calling. Maybe going there and visiting, but calling the zoning board, calling the health department for the septic permits, calling to find out about building codes. There's this item we talked about, the Interstate Land Sale Full Disclosure Act. Does it have to do with selling lots in your state or selling lots where?
Outside of your state.
Yeah, because you can't just swing by on your way home from work to check on it, right? It's for 25 or more lot projects with at least 25 lots that are undeveloped land across state lines. It means that developers who may be used to, bad developers that were maybe tried to cheat someone, fraudulently sell these properties, can't do it so easily anymore, because now there's an actual law they're breaking, which is this. There's wetlands restrictions. There's FEMA flood zones. We're going to talk about that today when we get to insurance. There's highway access restrictions. You can't just jump onto the highway with the driveway just because your house is right next to the biggest 4-lane highway that's in your area. You would have to follow protocol to be allowed to do that. And it would have to be for a pretty good reason. Septic is all about what? The number of square feet or the number of bedrooms? You're building a house that's at least 3,000 square feet. It needs to perk
Bedrooms.
It needs to perk for however many bedrooms you're trying to build in that house. So it doesn't matter how big the house is. I've seen houses that were 10,000 square feet, but 5 bedrooms Could they have fit 15 bedrooms? Absolutely. But they have large rooms, lots of family space. And so that big house, as long as it perks for a 5-bedroom septic system, they're okay if it's on a septic system. What's a way that you could get around that? What if the house is in the city limits, it's old, so it's still on a septic system, and they did some work finishing the basement. And so now, originally it was a 3-bedroom home, but in the basement they added 3 more. So now it's 6 bedrooms. The owner is excited for you to list the property as a 6-bedroom home. What conversation do you have to have with that owner about this situation? It's not on the city sewer, it's on a
You have to
septic.
let them know that it can't be listed as a 6-bedroom because the perk test, which was required, won't allow for it.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Let's see. And what we're looking for is the septic permit. That perk test resulted in a septic inspection, which resulted in a septic permit. Let me see if I can pull something up. The septic permit, at least in our area, here's a good one, is not very easy to look at. It's like super basic. It's drawn, it's hand drawn. It looks like some old boy drew it on the hood of his truck, like the inspector. And this is not far off from what it might look like. Literally, there's a space, and they just draw approximately where the house is, and then you can see in this case looks like 46 feet over to this would be the septic tank itself. And then they've drawn out where the septic tank leach fields go. Looks like there's a 50-foot line here and a 70-foot one there and a 60-foot one there. And then this magical phrase here, I was going to bring up, they say they need a 50% for repair area. Repair area means if any of these current leach field lines failed or got clogged or got crushed because you drove too big of a truck across the top, because they're not buried super deep. So a big enough truck, like a moving truck, could ruin them if it drove across in this area of the yard. If that happens, there needs to be room to add more lines if you had to. Or maybe they added another wing to the house, so they needed to make this whole thing bigger so it would perk for the extra 2-3 more bedrooms. 50 extra repair area is giving room up front for more leach fields to be added. Let's see. Here's an example of said leach fields. It might look like this. Depends on the pipes that are allowed to be used. Here we go. Might be something like that. So it just depends on the code and how big they need to be. And looks like this is a junction box. And I bet if the picture panned around, the camera panned around, we'd see the larger septic tank just off frame over here. Here's another one. There's an actual septic tank, kind of a big one with some leach fields. So that's how that goes together. Private. Here's where we left off. We'll pick up from here. Now we're finished with public land use controls enforced by the government. Private land use controls are enforced by citizens, bringing you to court, suing you over something. And it could be anything that is in these covenants and restrictions. If we look at covenants and restrictions, let's see here. It's literally a bunch of legal looking pages. I'm logging in to show you where we can come up with them. In real life, here's what it would look like. RMLS has a section that here we go. Public rec. No, yep, there it is. CC&R search. So I'm just going to check or look for covenants and restrictions. And my favorite one is Highland Creek because they have so many houses. You could look it up by book and page number if you happen to know the book and the page number. And then it's just a whole laundry list. So let's just pick one. And it's just as simple as this. Let's look. This is a little 3-page one for one of the little tiny subdivisions within the big subdivision of Highland Creek. And it's got the place where it was recorded in the upper right. You can see what date it was recorded in 2002 and who did it. Linda Maccabee of the Register of Deeds office. And then it says it's a supplemental declaration of conditions, covenants, and restrictions for Highland Creek. It talks about the date, talks about the statement. And then there's not much in this one. Let's see if there's another one, a better one. That might be bigger. But it could have rules about, this one is a couple more pages, about the fence. Could talk about the fence, maximum fence heights. Could talk about the lot sizes. There's probably a big version that covers the whole neighborhood, and then there's these little small supplemental ones. So sometimes we have to search, right? The easiest way to get our hands on the most recent covenants and restrictions is to ask the listing agent. Say, listing agent, having trouble finding this. Could you get the seller to ask the HOA, if there is one, or do they have a copy in their files? A seller should have been given the most recent covenants and restrictions back when they bought the property. And it's the easiest way to get them, is to have the seller get them for you. Hopefully they would do such a thing. So there we go. Those covenants and restrictions enforced by the HOA if there is one, and if there's not, enforced by the residents themselves. What's the worst that can happen if you cross the HOA, if you don't pay your HOA dues, for instance? What can happen to your property if you don't pay your dues? How much control and power does the HOA have?
Eventually, I think they could push you into foreclosure.
You bet. You could be foreclosed, lose the house because of not paying HOA dues. They have a lot of control, right? A lot of control with the HOA, and that's a problem for a lot of people. Again, under real estate license law, we as brokers, are responsible for discovery and disclosure of everything, any material facts, including the rules that you have to follow if you own property in a certain area. We have to make sure we don't accidentally or on purpose misrepresent. We have to look for potential restrictions. So look for red flags, like when we get to the insurance chapter and talk about flood zones. We haven't talked about flood zones yet, have we? Looking at heads shaking or nodding. I'm pretty sure we haven't. Okay, good. We have to look for red flags of like watermarks on the sides of buildings and things. So same thing here. We need to look for potential restriction. Might there be rules for this neighborhood? We just have to assume everyone might have them. But if everybody is in great shape, mowing the grass, and everybody's pristine and the flower beds look nice and there's no sloppy looking neighbors, odds are there's some rules in place. When you do drive through, and occasionally I should take a picture next time I drive through there, but there's a neighborhood I'm thinking about, and there's one particular house, and it's got a couple of big 6-foot fence segments. You know how you can buy a segment of fence from Lowe's, a big stockade wooden fence. He's got like 3 of them just kind of nailed together in the driveway as sort of a privacy thing to hide the tools that he leaves in the driveway because he works on his cars all the time. And it's got a blue tarp. Last time I was through there, a blue tarp kind of covering that thing he made. And obviously in an HOA or a CC&R neighborhood, he's not getting away with that. So that'd be a red flag. If I'm driving through there and I've never been in the area, I'd see that and I'd wonder, maybe there's no rules in this neighborhood. And if my client cares about that sort of thing, definitely something I would want to call their attention to. If there's a conflict between the restrictions in public versus private, which one do you have to follow? If the private land use controls are more strict than the public.
Whichever's stricter.
Always. Exactly right. Nailed it. Perfect. There we go. That is land use control. Let's take a look at the syllabus. We have a break coming up here in just a second. There we go. And we've made our way through. We've talked about basic concepts and property characteristics and ownership types, and disclosures is talking about environmental stuff. There's some other disclosures we'll get into when we get over to contracts. Taxation we talked about. We haven't yet talked about insurance. So let's see where we stand. This first part in the syllabus was the first week stuff we talked about when we got into the license law commission rules in the comments section. We've talked about fructus naturalis and all that fun stuff and appurtenant easements. And I'm hoping that you are regularly kind of skimming back and forth. Here's the part about zoning we just covered in the syllabus. Public land use, and then here's the taxes. We took a detour and went over and talked about taxes before land use control, and that involved calculating yearly taxes and what assessed value means, and the idea of a mill rate compared to $1 per 100 method of tax rate. The Machinery Act, octennial reappraisal, we've covered all that stuff. The timeline. Excise tax calculation. What was the definition? What was the formula for calculating excise tax? How do we determine what the sales tax called excise tax is going to be on a property?
Assessed value divided by 500 times $1 rounded.
Almost there, except not assessed value. Because it's a sales price, it's going to be based on the sales price. Because it's a sales tax, it's going to be based on the sale price. But that's a very common mistake, because we see the word tax and we think about tax value. So as excise tax, just think sales tax. So the government's going to want to get the biggest number, and usually the sale price is higher than the tax value. And that brings us to insurance. So we can go ahead and take a break now because it's only 2 minutes away. And then we'll come back and talk about it. So I'll see you back here in 10.
Hey mom. Hey mom.
Yes.
When is it okay?
Yes.
When is it okay to beat up a midget? When he stands next to your wife and says your hair smells good.
Oh my God! Oh, damn, like that one.
Hey mom. Hey mom.
Yes.
When is it okay?
Yes.
When is it okay to beat up a midget? When he stands next to your wife and says your hair smells good.
Oh my God!
going to talk about property insurance. Just a second. Let me pull this up. There we go. There we go. Okay. Property insurance is not a very big chapter. Let's see. It's under section 4 of your syllabus. So I need to update that. Instead of 14, it should be 4. And it's right after ad valorem property tax and excise tax. In fact, I'll show it to you. Here we go. So here it is, section 4 of your syllabus. We talked about ad valorem tax and calculated it. Then we did the whole tax concept, tax system, and then excise tax. And then C, under section 4, is insurance. So we're going to make our way through and see most of these definition words, talk about coverage, talk about kinds of policies, and then flood insurance, and our responsibility as brokers. That's level 3 is that part. Let's go ahead and look at that. Here's how I want you to study if you're not already doing this. I think this is the most helpful. So lead with the syllabus. I think I've preached that a lot already. But read through the section in the syllabus before you read the content or the actual textbook part. So what is anytime you see level 3, take a minute to read it, because it's the most detailed of something you need to know. It's the topic that you need to know very thoroughly. So we as brokers need to advise our client about the importance of having and maintaining the right amount of insurance coverage throughout the listing and transfer of title or the closing. In other words, maybe the seller isn't going to live there anymore. Maybe it's a vacant property. And so they say, do I even need insurance? Could I just not pay that anymore? Well, if they have a loan, the lender requires it to stay insured the whole time. So that's an easy yes. But even if it's paid for, they need insurance, because what if it burned down, right? Anybody, the paid for house still should have insurance. So you as a broker would want to talk to them about that sort of thing. Listing agent should advise the absentee seller, a seller who doesn't live there, to verify continued insurance coverage of the unoccupied listed property. What does all that mean? We're going to see that in the content in a minute, but the insurance company wants to know if you're living there full time or not. Because if they find out that maybe the property was damaged because of vandalism, it's more likely to be damaged from vandalism if nobody lives there, because there's nobody there to discourage people from doing that, right? And you don't catch it quickly. Anything that goes wrong isn't caught quickly, and something like a water leak could get worse if it's not caught because people don't live there regularly. So if it's unoccupied or vacant, those are two different things we'll learn about in a minute. The insurance company is asked to cover something like a water leak or a vandal situation. They might not cover it if in their investigation they find out you weren't living there at the time full time. You weren't there for 3 months, or you haven't lived there since last year for whatever reason. So it's important as listing agents that we advise our seller clients, look, if you're not residing there, tell your insurance company so they can make a note of it. They might charge them more, but the upside is if something goes wrong and you have to turn in or file an insurance claim, they would still include coverage because you were honest and you told them that there's a higher risk now. That's the idea. And here's the thing about red flags. We need to be alert for red flags, particularly when it comes to flood insurance. So as we're going through the slides and as you read the chapter in the yellow book, look for these items in particular, right? Go through. You could even not read right away. Maybe you're not in the mood to just read and focus and concentrate. Just go through and pretend like you're a teaching assistant or a professor yourself, and you're just looking for where these items are. Just go through that chapter and look for wherever it says high insurance claim history. That'll be easy to do if you have the online version of the book, because you can do a search exactly for that phrase. But even if you have the printed book, you could also maybe do a search in the index in the back of the big printed book. And the index will tell you every page that this clue report shows up on in the entire book. So go through, and I would do that first before I even took the time to read the chapter in full. I'd go through and highlight based on just reading the words. Go find the word and the definition, highlight it, maybe even write it in the margin. Anything that's a level 3, I would probably label it that way. Maybe use a certain color of highlighter for level 3 stuff to remind you as you're going through the book later, when you've turned it into a review document because you've marked it so well, that you need to spend a little more time on the level 3 stuff. And what else was it in the level 3? Disclose the location of any part of a property in a special flood zone as a material fact. And then buyer client should be advised to check the availability and cost of insurance as part of their due diligence. What does that mean? We talked about the process of under contract. We said that when the property goes under contract, at this point in time, it's under contract, the offer was accepted and everybody signed it and communicated it, and now we are under contract. Well, there's some amount of time that is called a due diligence period. And so part, or maybe all, but usually it's a portion of this under contract time between the contract being formed and the closing, the end line, the finish line, that is the due diligence period. This last point we saw is saying our buyer client, when we're a buyer agent for somebody helping a buyer purchase, we need to highly suggest that they shop for insurance before this deadline day, sometime in this period of time. Why? Because it might turn out that the property has a history of a lot of insurance claims. Like if it were a flood zone, maybe every year it floods so badly that they have to file a claim every time. Let me see if I can find what I'm thinking about. I sold a property that had, that was in a flood zone years ago, and the seller told me that they had to get flood insurance because they knew for sure it was going to flood every so often. It's just a matter of time. And so I disclosed properly, and the buyer ended up being a real estate agent herself. She had a real estate license. She came forward. She actually owned the property that my listing backed up to. And so that's partly why she was interested in buying it and didn't care that it was in a flood zone. Number one, hers was too, that it backed up to, so she was used to it. And number two, it was in an area she liked, and so she bought it. So told her about the flood zone, told her about the flood insurance, not a surprise. She ended up calling the insurance company. The current sellers, my clients, sorry, I'm not looking at you in the camera because I'm looking for something. I want to show you a picture of her property when it flooded. My clients had to pay extra money for an insurance policy for just the flood zone, just flood insurance. So it's over and above what you would normally pay for homeowners insurance. It's an extra. And this flood insurance for them was going to be $3,000 per year for flood insurance. $3,000 per year. But there was some sort of special North Carolina subsidy program that they got involved with that allowed them to only have to pay a tenth of that. 1/10, $300 extra per year. Pretty good deal, right? Well, this buyer, real estate agent / buyer, called the insurance company that my people did business with and said, hey, I'm buying the house. They currently have flood insurance through you. I want to do that same subsidy program. Is that possible? And it was possible. Problem was, I don't know what happened in the phone call, but she ticked them off. She I don't know if she yelled at them or she was disrespectful, but they didn't want to do business with her. And so all I found out later was she called me and said, "Hey, they won't sell me the policy at the discount rate, the subsidy rate, and I'm not paying an extra $3,000 a year for flood insurance, so deal is dead. I'm walking." And I said, "Wait a minute, okay, what happened?" I called the insurance company. I didn't know them, but I called them and said, so and so, my buyer for my listing called you, and that person said, "Yeah, oh, I remember her. She was not very nice, and we don't want to do business with her. And if she ever did file a claim," and she inevitably will have to because it's likely that the property is going to flood. Let me just go ahead and show you. We don't want to deal with her. So she ruined it. Here's the view from her front porch, even just this past year. So she's standing maybe about 5 feet above the yard. So you can see, that's the bottom of the stairs. And this was like the very next day after a lot of rain, and that's the cul-de-sac. And so here's what it ended up looking like the day of. Let me see if I can turn the volume off. That was while it was raining. And you can see all that should be green. It should be the grass in the yard. And so the building is flooded. All the front yard is just covered. So anyway, I spent 3 hours that day calling around trying to find another insurance company that would honor this same subsidy program, and nobody would. Finally, I called the existing one back and said, "Are you sure?" Because my poor sellers already moved to Texas. They had gone ahead and moved with a job, and they would have been really messed up if this closing didn't go as scheduled, because it was only supposed to be another week to close. And they said, "No, we definitely don't want to work with her, but it turns out our competition down the street works within the same program, and we would love for them to have to put up with her. And so why don't you just give her their information?" And so I forgot their info, and I called the agent/buyer, and I said, and we had enough of a relationship that I could get away with talking to her a little more informally. And I'm like, "Okay, look, put on your manners this time. Don't screw this one up. We have one more chance to make this work. Please call this insurance company and try to get that policy in place with the same subsidy program." And she did. To her credit, she did. And this was probably 20 years ago. But she's on my Facebook. And so this was just this most recent rain we had here in our area. And that's what it looks like. Probably maybe once a year, maybe every couple of years, but I'm looking for more. I think that's about it. That's what she's okay dealing with. I wouldn't. I don't want to deal with that, but she does. And so with full disclosure, long as she knew, it's all that matters. Discover and disclose. So my seller told me we're in a flood zone, and I said, "Okay, tell me the details." And so I just told the whole world the details. Let's talk about just regular plain insurance first, and then we'll get into the flood stuff. But property insurance. So let me think. I don't think we've talked about no, we have. We've talked about one kind of insurance so far. Who can remember what kind of insurance we've talked about in this class?
Was it E&O insurance?
No, that's a good one though, but that's what we as brokers have to carry to protect ourselves when we're doing business. But think about what the attorney does during a under contract phase. When it comes to the deed, they do a search to make sure that people have owned it. There's a clear chain of ownership. What kind of insurance are we looking to get that has to do with that search? The deed, another word for a deed, is a title.
Title insurance.
Thank you. Yeah. Title insurance. We've talked about title insurance. So that's one kind of insurance that we deal with. That's not this. Unrelated. It's just that, hey, there's a couple of different kinds of insurance that we deal with. There's this, there's that, there's flood insurance. There's another one that we'll get into when we talk about finance called private mortgage insurance. But this is about the property. Just the term you might see used is hazard insurance. Hazard means a combination of liability and casualty insurance. Those combined form hazard insurance or property insurance. So we're talking about what happens if the property gets damaged or destroyed. If you get a loan, get a mortgage to buy this property, you better believe absolutely that mortgage lender is going to require this property to stay insured. So much so that they're going to prefer that you let them pay it. You're still paying it, but they would rather you let them send the payment in. So when we get to that part, there it is. Your monthly payment is going to include principal and interest. Principal and interest payment, let's say maybe $900 toward your principal loan balance every month. Sorry, let's do that combined. That doesn't make sense in the beginning. Both of these together, principal and interest, let's say $900, and then taxes, and then insurance. The acronym is PITI, P-I-T-I. Taxes, 1/12 of whatever the annual bill, and then insurance, 1/12 of whatever the annual bill is. And let's say the taxes are another $300 a month, and the insurance is another $100. So your total payment would be $1,300 a month, PITI. And maybe if you have an HOA, you'd add on top of that. But the lender, the mortgage company, might want you to send them $1,300 a month, and they're going to take out $300 and put it in an escrow account where they hold that money until the bill comes out for taxes. And then they're going to put the $100 for insurance into an escrow account to hold your money until it's time to pay the insurance bill. So that's how important this thing is, right? Because it's protecting their collateral. You've put up the property as collateral for the loan. So we're going to talk about different types of homeowners or HO insurance and concepts and terminology and co-insurance. So here's title insurance. We've talked about already. We haven't yet covered mortgage insurance because we're teaching this stuff in a different order now. But this is homeowners insurance. The homeowner is called the insured one, right? The insured person is the homeowner. The premium is the thing that they have to pay every year. And you might pay your insurance once or twice a year. If you don't have to send it in with your mortgage payment like a lot of people do, you don't have to. You could choose to just pay it when it's due, and you could also choose to pay it every quarter. Different insurance companies might allow you to pay every couple of months, every quarter, maybe twice a year, just depends. But whatever it is that you're paying is the consideration. It's the premium, the homeowner's insurance premium. You'll hear that phrase a lot in the real life, in the wild. Because when we go to closing and we're going to see the settlement statement with all the dollars and cents written out in one document. And we're going to have to tell our buyer, client, if we're the buyer agent, okay, I see where the homeowner's insurance premium is listed here. Let's make sure that that's the amount that they quoted you, right? You'd want to make sure that they verified that whatever they were promised it was going to cost by the insurance company they chose is the right number. And so we have this word consideration. And when we get into the contract chapter on what it takes to have a contract with someone, one of the things is an item of value. And that word is consideration. And so here we are again, paying something. Paying the premium itself is the consideration. Because this insurance policy is a contract between you, the insured, and the insurer, the insurance company themselves. You are saying, hey, insurance company, please step up to the plate if a hurricane blows off my roof, if somebody comes over to visit and goes in the attic for some reason and steps through the ceiling, or if somebody gets hurt on my property, please cover and protect me in the financial situation where those things happen. The coverage, right? So they're insuring the property, reimbursing the owner for loss by whatever events are covered by the policy. It's really fun reading to read an insurance policy and see what that coverage is, because you better believe they had a series of attorneys write this language very specifically to give themselves some loopholes, right? So you just have to, when you're shopping for insurance, we don't have to do that as brokers for our clients, by the way. But if you yourself are shopping for insurance, you got to got to read through those policies and make sure that the coverage is fully disclosed, that you know what you're getting into. What are you paying for? What are they going to cover? Like the example we saw in an environmental chapter. In a flood insurance policy, they'll cover the flood damage, but not the mold damage, not fixing the mold problem, even though we all know the mold is because of the flood. But that's a loophole, classic loophole that an insurance company looks for to get out of having to pay some certain part of a thing. So it's just a transfer of risk. The insurance that you're buying is a transfer of the risk from the owner of the property to the policy holders affiliated with that insurance company. So we have a couple kinds of insurance involved in this homeowner's policy. Homeowner's policy, another word for that is hazard policy or a package policy. And it involves casualty insurance, which covers the losses caused by damage, the improvements of the property. It's hard to hurt dirt, right? So it's not like the yard got a hole in it. That's not part of it. But the house has a problem. A car ran into the side of it, or there was some sort of a catastrophic kind of a thing. And then liability, losses or damage caused to third parties or their property. Somebody comes to visit and they slip on the front porch and fall and hurt themselves. Your insurance policy has some coverage for that, hopefully enough. If not, they might end up suing you, or their insurance company might sue your insurance company. You need that coverage, right? So it's casualty plus liability, the property plus the people. So the homeowner's insurance policies are identified with the initials HO, so a homeowner's policy, and there's different numbers, and it depends on which number as to what the kind of policy is. You don't need to know all of them, mainly just the ones in green. An HO3 policy is a homeowner's insurance policy that is the bare minimum most lenders will agree with and allow. An HO2 policy has even less coverage. An HO8 policy has the most coverage, maybe for like a super big fancy house with all kinds of extras. So anything in between is some variation of coverage. And you mainly need to focus on the 3, the 4, and the 6. So the HO2 is not a good enough amount of coverage to satisfy a mortgage lender. They require at least an HO3 policy. Any policy has deductibles listed in there. How much is it going to be if you do have to get some kind of a coverage, pay your deductible, right? It's an agreement to insure. Think about a contract. When we're looking through this, this is just a contract, again, between the insured person and the insurer. We also have a declaration page that pretty much spells out what this policy is all about. And then a list of all the various provisions of the policy. What sort of exceptions might there be? We're not covering, a lot of times I think, what is it? I believe war and terrorist activity are not automatically included in the typical homeowner policy, for example, right? So what other kinds of restrictions are there or exclusions are there? It'll have conditions. It'll have endorsements, and it'll have exclusions. Endorsements are extra things. Or if you've heard the term rider, you need a rider to your insurance policy. A rider or an endorsement would be something like, oh, I've got a guitar collection. I want you to cover that too. There's a blues guitar player named Joe Bonamassa, and he buys all of these 1959 and 1960s era Les Paul guitars that are worth literally $300,000. And he's got a whole room full of them. He probably has them listed, right, in his insurance policy as endorsements, or a rare book collection, or any sort of collection. Any sort of extra thing that's normally not covered in a policy can be if you pay extra. And it's not all that much. I mean, that guitar example is probably an exception, but to have an average extra amount of coverage, maybe your engagement ring or your spouse's engagement ring, for a moderate amount per month, they'll add that. So all of those are various optional endorsements that you could have. Exclusions are things that are not covered in the typical policy. So it's good to know this when you're shopping, not have a rude awakening that something was excluded. How can we know in this business, in a typical transaction, if a property might have had several insurance claims filed against it? Is there some sort of history or like a sales history? We look at the MLS for sales history of what properties sold for over time, but there is indeed a way to see what the insurance claims history is on a given property. Covers 7 years, and it's called the CLUE report. CLUE is the acronym for Comprehensive Loss Underwriting Exchange. As a homeowner, you are entitled to one CLUE report per year. It goes back 7 years, and it's just a history of the major claims that have been brought against this property. Because if you're a buyer agent helping your buyer purchase this thing, and maybe there's something that comes up on the inspection, and the thought is, well, there was evidence that there's a recurring water problem in the basement. I wonder if they've ever gotten so bad that they have filed a homeowner's insurance claim about it. And then you could ask the listing agent to get the CLUE report from the seller. Hey, seller, could you please get the free CLUE report and share it with us? It's not a normal course of events, not a normal thing that we always do, but it's available. It's a thing. And when you're shopping for homeowners insurance, it is the CLUE report that insurance company person you're talking to is going to look at. They're going to pull it and look at it to decide if they want to offer insurance, because it may be that there's such a recurring problem. Maybe it's flood, maybe it's something else. Because of this property, it just keeps having a recurring history of insurance claims that they don't want to cover it at all. Or they will cover it, but not at the normal rate. They might charge a higher rate, higher deductible, because it's more likely that it will be there will be a claim brought against it based on the historical behavior. So, could a homeowner insurance premium cause the borrower to lose loan approval? How would that be tied in? Loan approval is about what you can afford. They look at your debt to income ratio, how much you can afford per month. So if the homeowner's insurance for this given house ends up to be higher than the estimated amount, yeah, absolutely, it could cause a borrower to lose loan approval because they can't afford the house payment plus the insurance amount that's going to be required here. Borrowers should investigate homeowners insurance during the due diligence period. Yes, that's the whole point. So during the due diligence period is when we want to do all inspections, any sort of investigation to decide the big question: does the buyer want to actually go through with this sale or not? And so this would be yet one more, along with inspecting the property, along with trying to get approved for the home loan, getting homeowners insurance at a rate or an amount of a premium that you can afford per year is a valid reason to check. Is a valid item of due diligence to look into during the due diligence period. So yes, they should investigate insurance. Sometimes I've noticed agents don't think about this right away, and they almost forget until the very last week before closing, and they say, oh, by the way, you're going to go on and get homeowners insurance. Bad time to do that. Let's go ahead and do it early up front during the due diligence period, just in case there's some weird anomaly about this property that makes it cost extra more. Usually when the mortgage lender, loan officer, is quoting the payment and the other terms to somebody, they will say, well, I'm just estimating the homeowner's insurance is going to be so many dollars per month. But again, if this property has some extenuating circumstance that causes that number to be a lot higher, need to figure that out in time for the buyer to be able to walk away and only lose their due diligence money, not lose the earnest money too. Here's the big concern for the insurance company. One of the things they're going to need to be kept up to date on is, hey, did the owner paying this policy, did they end up living there full time? Did they go ahead and move out because they needed to relocate? And so the property is sitting empty for weeks and weeks and months at a time. So the difference between occupied and vacant. Occupied obviously means you're there. Another word you run into is unoccupied. Unoccupied versus vacant means unoccupied, your stuff is still there. You're just popping in, you can stay, and the plates are there, the furniture is there. And if you walk through, if you were a burglar broken in and you walked through it, you wouldn't know. You'd assume they're just down the street, almost coming home. But maybe they're away for weeks at a time. That's unoccupied. Vacant is empty as well. Vacant means there's nothing in there either. And so the insurance company needs to be told whether it's unoccupied or vacant so that the coverage remains in place and so they don't deny coverage in the event something goes wrong, like a water leak, like some sort of vandalism situation. Here's a very real world possibility. We touched on it a few weeks ago, but the difference between a closing and a settlement meeting. Closing, we just think everything is a closing. Congratulations, you closed on the property. But a closing hasn't happened until the deed got recorded. What happens before the closing is signing all the papers, and that is called the settlement meeting, right? So it's the idea of, say, on a Friday, because courthouse and the Register of Deeds office is closed for the weekend. So on a Friday, we've set the closing date, assuming that once they sign all the papers, they're going to record the deed and it's going to close. But for some reason, there's a delay. And the mortgage company, maybe there was a delay with the mortgage company. Maybe there was a delay in negotiating, or maybe you went for the walkthrough before closing and found out there was still a bunch of repair items that didn't get fixed. Some reason we're possibly not going to close today as scheduled. So what we thought was going to be a 10 a.m. closing turned into a 3 p.m. settlement meeting. And everybody got together at 3. Thank goodness the attorney could still accommodate because they were super busy and had a full schedule, but they found a time slot. And so we were hoping for 10 a.m., but we're meeting our clients at 3 p.m. And the bad news is by the time everything gets signed, it's 4:15. It is after 4 p.m. The Register of Deeds office closes online and in person at 4 p.m. So we had a settlement meeting. We just finished it. But what we were not going to have today on this Friday is a closing because the Register of Deeds office isn't open to record the deed with. So what we have, the old timers call it a dry closing. What we call it is a settlement, but no closing. And so the first concern we as brokers need to think about to address with our client is, hey, client, our plan was for you to give possession today. Seller, you were going to get your money today because once the deed gets recorded, they're going to release the funds to you. And therefore, you were going to give the keys to the buyer for the property access today. But now the deed's not getting recorded till Monday. Do you want to give the keys to the buyer? Are you a listing broker giving your seller advice to go ahead and, no big deal. Just go ahead and let that buyer have their keys. Let's paint this situation. All their belongings are on a moving truck. They drove it to the closing attorney's office. It's parked in the driveway. They are now homeless, right? The house they sold a house to buy this house. They didn't buy this house today. It's not finished. It's not closed. It won't close till Monday at best. What are they going to do? And oh, by the way, it's not even a U-Haul, or even if it were, they'd have to pay extra for the extra days they have it. But if it's a moving truck with a moving company, now they're going to have to pay a whole lot more. Either they're going to have to pay to a mini storage facility to offload the truck full of stuff today and send the truck back to the moving company, right? Let the moving guys take the truck because they have other jobs this weekend. Or they're going to have to pay to leave it on the truck until Monday. We've got a lot of extra costs that they're facing at this point, right? So do you think that buyer is frustrated? And the seller is frustrated too because they're not getting their money today either. And if the seller's not getting their money, they don't have to give the keys away to the buyer. They still could, though, because the buyer might say something like this: hey, I know this is all a terrible, nasty situation and surprise, but, we would really appreciate it if you'd go ahead and let us move in today like we planned. Go ahead and give us the keys, even though the deed has not been recorded, even though seller has not gotten their money. Everything's in line. There's no reason that it won't close successfully on Monday. So what's the harm in giving us the keys, letting us go ahead and move in? Or sometimes the buyer will say, hey, we won't move into the house, but could you at least let us empty the moving truck into the garage? How do we feel about that? Give me a thumbs up if you see no problem with that. Or in the chat, say, sounds good to me. Give me a thumbs up if you think Neil is setting you up. Because there's absolutely liability here, right? And that's what this is about. We would need to say, hey, you guys can do whatever you want to. I, as your broker, advise that you don't give keys until you got your money, seller. I, as the buyer's agent, is going to try. I'm going to try really hard to get that other side to go ahead and give my buyer the keys. But whatever they decide is between them. The main thing is you want to tell these clients, look, whatever you decide, let's make sure the proper insurance coverage is in place. It's okay to let the buyer move in early. Yes, there's risk. They might burn the place down. They might start a bonfire in a 55-gallon barrel in the garage, and they might be stupid and burn the place down. The main thing is it insured? So whenever we have a settlement on a Friday, but a closing and not until Monday or some amount of time later, the seller should leave their insurance policy in place instead of canceling it. They had it set to cancel today because they thought they weren't going to be an owner after today. They need to change that right away. Call the insurance company first if there's a delay. Say, hey, I'm still the owner. Don't cancel the policy. I still need an owner's policy for another few days. And then the buyer, maybe they are dealing with a super cool seller. The seller's like, you know what? You seem like nice folks, responsible, and I don't feel that I'm going to end up with a burned down house. I will let you move in, but you have to get a renter's policy. That buyer needs to go ahead and change their plans with their insurance company and say, hey, insurance company, I was going to be the owner today, but now it's going to be a couple more days, but I am going to be taking possession of the property like a renter would. So please give me a smaller policy that just covers my belongings. What if it's not even them who's not careful and burned the place down? What if the seller or somebody else does something that damages the property and therefore the buyer's belongings? So in this event, closing is delayed, but we're going ahead and giving possession to the buyer. Make sure the buyer gets a renter's policy that covers their personal belongings if they're moving them into the house. And then the seller keeps it covered as an owner's policy. So who owns the property? The seller still owns it. Who is insured? That's what you have to make sure you get done properly, right? Real estate brokers should have buyers and sellers contact their insurance company before moving in or out of a property. Yes or no? Or true or false?
True.
You got it. Need to advise and tell them, call their insurance company. During the under contract period, when they are shopping for insurance and choosing one, that's not really a lot that you as a broker have to do with. You advise them to do it, but they're the ones calling the insurance company. They're the ones getting quotes from different insurance companies and deciding who they want to pick. You just prompt them, tell them, look, go do this. And in this situation of a delayed closing, you tell them, look, call that insurance company back. Make sure you get the proper coverage for what you are for the next few days. And if you're talking to the buyer, what they are for the next few days is a renter, if they have been given permission to move in. By the way, there's a small little mini lease that we use. It's called a buyer possession before closing agreement, where it spells out who pays for what, like HOA and lawn maintenance and who's going to, oh, by the way, keep the insurance coverage. And then there's also one for when a seller stays after closing. Sometimes you have a situation where the seller says, look, I need time to move out of here. It's the house that I raised a family in. It's huge. It's got a basement full of stuff. And especially in a seller's market like we're in, the seller can call the shots a little more. And it's a lot easier right now for a seller to get an offer from a buyer and say, hey, buyer, part of our offer is that you let us stay for 2 weeks after closing. If that's something, seller staying after closing, seller possession after closing, we've closed it. We've recorded the deed. The seller's gotten their money. The buyer's gotten at least one key because now they're the owner, but the seller has permission to keep living there for whatever reason. That's fine. But make sure the insurance companies are updated. Now that buyer needs the insurance owner's policy, but they're not going to occupy it. And the seller needs to convert their owner's policy to a renter's policy because they're staying after closing. Now, not all properties, but some are in a location that is prone to flooding. And so Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is where we find out. There's FEMA maps that show the different flood plains. The likelihood of a property to be affected by flooding, those times when a lot of rain comes down or the conditions are conducive to flooding, to the point where the flooding waters could reach the house, that's usually the signal that it needs flood insurance. But what if it's like on 10 acres and there's a creek, like a little creek on the back of the property? And let's see, it might look like this. Draw my highly skilled artwork. Maybe it's like a big old 10-acre parcel. And here's the little house because it's such a big parcel. And maybe way back here, there's a creek. Well, because of that creek, the waters of the creek could rise up, but maybe they don't ever come any closer to the house than this. The house is here. Well, in this case, it might not require flood insurance. This property may not need it. FEMA maps would show the flood zone comes out to here because it's different colors on the map. And you just plug in an address and you can see. But we as brokers are responsible for making sure that it's in a floodplain, right? Is it in a floodplain? That's question one. Does it require flood insurance? That's the next question. Here we go. I'm going to show it to you, but I can't find it at the moment. But as brokers, we need to find out a couple ways to find out if it's in a floodplain. A survey. That's the best way. The best way is to get a survey. And if the seller doesn't have one, you might want to counsel them to get one. Get a survey so we can see what the floodplain is. But you can go to FEMA, I think FEMA.gov, plug in an address, and it'll show you that. I wouldn't make any promises or guarantees. We're just going to FEMA and seeing what it says to give us some kind of a direction. But again, just because a property is in a floodplain doesn't mean flood insurance is required. We need to do some research and find out, is it required or not? Step one, see if the seller currently has a policy. If we don't discover and disclose this stuff about floodplains, we can be guilty of a combination of these things: willful or negligent misrepresentation or omission. It's a material fact if a property is in a floodplain or not. That means it's a requirement for us to find out. We have to accurately disclose. So, disclosure and advice. We're giving them advice about stuff. Our responsibility is compliance with the contract, the sales contract. Hey, here's what you have to do because here's what you agreed to do according to the contract. When it comes to insurance, we're walking the property as a buyer agent or a listing agent, and we're looking for red flags for flooding. And red flags might be, let me pull that up. Might look like this. Some combination of some watermarks. This is probably a little extreme. This would not be any surprise. I think every one of us, no matter our experience level, would think something's not right here. This was not intentional. This property had some water damage, or it could be bubbling of paint, or it could be some version in between the two. This red line here shows some water damage, flaking paint, probably in a basement based on what the floor looks like. Looks like it goes all the way up to 2 feet from the floor. So looking for these sorts of things, especially in basement properties, that it could easily be prone to flooding. So we need to look for that and ask the seller questions. If we're there on a listing appointment, we're going to ask, hey, do you have flood insurance now? Do you have any water issues down here in this basement or in the crawl space? And if they deny, then look it up on FEMA. If it shows a floodplain, just let them know, look, FEMA says in the FEMA maps, it says that you're in a floodplain. So I have to report that. So which of the following is a material fact? That the seller maintains FEMA flood insurance, or that the property is in a FEMA floodplain? Which one? They're not both material facts. One of them is, one of them is not.
Just the property.
Yeah, just the property. Why not the first one? Why don't we have to disclose that they maintain flood insurance? Why not that one? Maybe it's not required, but they want it anyway. For whatever reason, they're paranoid about it. They just want to have it. They don't have to, they don't want to. But again, they're just extra cautious. Well, if they maintain the flood insurance, it might just be because of their preference, not because of the floodplain. What we owe as a material fact is that it's in a floodplain. But if the seller's maintaining flood insurance because they just want it, but not because the property requires it, then it's not a material fact. Does that make sense? The thing that we owe is whether it's in a floodplain or not. Not that we have a very super hyper vigilant, careful, cautious, extra overboard cautious seller that chooses to have it. Why do they choose to have it? Because they feel better. That's not a material fact. Why do they choose to have it? Because it's in a floodplain. Oh, wait. Now that is a material fact. So that's the difference there. If the seller currently has flood insurance and the buyer must continue the flood insurance, yes or no? Kind of goes back to that last question. Why does the seller?
If it's required, I'm assuming.
Exactly. If it's required, then yes. But if the seller just has it because they want it, not required, then no. So we need to do some research, find out. Let's, before the break here, that's it for slides on that. But let's take a look at the syllabus. Fill in the blanks. See where things stand with this flood stuff. Okay. Okay, gotta go back a little bit. There's a variety of terms. We talked about insurance, the stuff, so what those whole chapter's about. The insured is the homeowner. The insurer is the insurance company. The premium is the amount you're paying for it. The conditions and endorsements and exclusions have to do with the different provisions of the policy, what is covered and what isn't. Casualty versus liability insurance. Casualty means the objects and the property. Liability means someone getting hurt or their belongings getting damaged when they're visiting you, for instance. So I'd write out those definitions, right? Go through, make a reference of the exclusion shows up and what is a definition, and I'd highlight it over there in that yellow book. Package insurance, also known, I'd write the word hazard insurance off to the side, is a combination of property and liability. A bare minimum required by the lender is HO3. HO3. By the way, we're going to get to that in a minute. Co-insurance, we'll get into that later. Specialized policies. So HO3 is the bare minimum required by a lender. An HO4 policy is what a renter gets. That's renter's insurance. And then when you live in a condominium, what's special about a condo compared to a single family house? What do you own when you own a condo?
Space in between the wall.
Yeah, so the insurance on a condo would be different than the insurance on a house. On a house, we care if the roof falls off. We care in a condo too, but the roof isn't our responsibility. Our insurance policy doesn't have to cover the roof when we live in a condo. So a condo policy with that limited, less coverage of just the interior, painted surface to painted surface, is an HO6. That's all testable. Knowing a condo coverage policy is HO6 versus a standard homeowner insurance policy is HO3 versus a renter's policy is HO4. Just those three, 4, and 6. Because condo coverage is going to be what? Your personal property and things like the kitchen cabinets, anything that's in between the painted surfaces of the walls. That's covered under a condo policy. And what's the difference between a condo policy and a renter's policy? The renter's is just the personal property. It's not the cabinetry. It's not everything in the painted wall space, airspace, because you don't own it at all. You're a renter. So all you care about having coverage on is just your items, your belongings. So that buyer needs to make sure that they have the right amount of coverage in terms of dollar amount of coverage, and the style, the type. In real life, in the wild, again, you're going to say, hey, buyer, now's the time for you to shop for insurance. And they're going to talk to an insurance agent. And that agent's going to help them and put together the policy of however much coverage they want, the bare minimum, and then maybe they add some because they have a collection of some sort. And then that insurance agent will send the insurance binder, basically a quote, or it's not a quote because they're done, they've picked it. Insurance binder, which is sort of like here's what this costs and here's the coverage, over to the attorney. The attorney can see what the dollar amount is being charged, so they'll know to collect that from the buyer. Because, by the way, we'll learn this in the closing chapter. The buyer has to pay, this is testable, the buyer pays the first year's insurance premium up front at closing. They're paying the entire first year at closing. So that's all part of the process. We'll come back from break and talk about these next syllabus items on flood insurance. So I'll see you back here in 10. couple more slides to share with you. Hit some of those definitions. I found a slide deck I wanted to share. Okay, wait a minute. Oh, good. There we go. This is Dearborn has some slides, and I wanted to make sure I hit all the highlights. So let me share this with you. Here we go. So yeah, some of the terms that we saw there in the syllabus. The policy is the agreement, right? It's a contract between the insured and the insurer. Is the insurance policy. The insurer being the company who is reimbursing the owner in the event of a loss by something that is a covered event. The premiums are how much you pay for it, how much you're paying for that coverage. Condition is a limitation on the coverage of an insured property, and an endorsement is extra coverage that's not in the typical original policy, often called a rider. And then an exclusion is something not covered. We talked about that. Property or casualty, also known as hazard insurance. And then liability is the loss or damage caused to a third party or their property while they're visiting you. Package policy is both. That's the hazard insurance that we're talking about. The HO1 policy is the most basic form of homeowners policy, but again, it won't be good enough for most lenders. Lenders want at least an HO3, but let's see what an HO1 has. Personal injury to others from the insured's act of negligence and physical damage to their property caused by the insured person. Coverage against damage caused by fire, lightning, glass breakage, windstorm, and hail. So that's the basic version. The HO2 is called a named peril policy. It covers more than just the basic HO1. It includes falling objects, weight of ice, snow, sleet, more things. And those perils, those extra things would be named in the policy, but still not good enough. This is the bare minimum for most lenders. An all-risk policy provides more coverage than two because loss and damage to real property caused by all perils is covered unless it's not, unless they specifically exclude it. The most commonly used residential policy, and again, minimum coverage by most lenders. They say you've got to have at least an HO3 policy. HO4 is the renter's policy or tenant's policy, the same as HO2, because all it's really dealing with is the personal property itself. The HO5 is the most elaborate, broadest homeowners policy, not required by most lenders. It's an all-risk basis for the dwelling and other structures, including personal property, but it's more than required for a mortgage company. HO6 is the condo insurance because it's airspace, it's the personal property, but also the things mounted to the walls of the unit. Meaning fixtures, cabinetry, things like that. And by the way, 7 is for owners of really expensive property, and 8 is when the property has less market value than the cost it is to replace them for older homes. So those are specialized extra things. You probably wouldn't see these on your test. Again, 3, 4, and 6 are the most important ones for you guys. So this agreement to insure is something you sign saying, look, I acknowledge that the insurance company is going to reimburse in the event of a covered loss while I make my payments, while I make my timely payments of the premium. That declaration page outlines the rating of the insurance, the limitations, the deductibles, how much money you might have to pay personally before coverage can be applied, sort of like health insurance. Any endorsements or perils that have been added to the policy, any sort of exclusions. And notice here the name of a mortgagee, the name of the lender if this is a property you're using a mortgage to purchase. So all that's on the declaration page. Standard provisions, the details, the fine print, the details of the coverage, any sort of conditions or extra endorsements. We talked about the clue report already. Basically, up to 7 years of personal auto and personal property claims history, and underwriters for the insurance company, when they're deciding to give the insurance or not, they usually look at the clue report. Here's the part about vacant versus unoccupied. There are exclusions usually for vacant properties, again, because nobody's there to catch it if something goes wrong. Greater chance of theft, damage, vandalism that could affect your claims. So the definition for an insurance company is a substantially empty of personal property necessary to sustain normal occupancy. It's basically empty. People aren't living there. And so theft or attempted theft, if the damage occurs within 30 or 60 days, they have all this fine print that says, look, if you're not living there, there's more chance of damage, of claims that need to be brought against the policy. Therefore, we are going to charge you more, possibly. Fire and water damage, wind damage usually stays in place in these policies. Unoccupied, you could still just come in there and spend the night. You could come in there and use stuff. Stuff is still there. Personal property is there as if you were to return at any minute. The coverage probably is going to be about the same, but insurance companies are looking for 60 consecutive days as the timeline between unoccupied and vacant. Property owners should make sure the building is not vacant for longer than that amount of time. In the investigation, in the event of a situation that results in a request for coverage, they're going to ask these questions. The insurance investigator, adjuster is going to say, hey, were you living here? Were you sleeping here? Where were you? And they're looking for that 60-day threshold. And so we just need to advise that they call and talk to their insurance company if they think they're going to not be around for an extended period, because their coverage could be affected. Most contracts, including our standard 2T of North Carolina, does say that risk of loss due to fire or other events is on the seller. It's the seller's problem during an under contract period up till closing. And we'll get into this more in the contract chapter, but by the way, if the house were to get destroyed, the seller's policy would be looked at to cover it, right? It's the seller's insurance policy. But it's actually, listen to this one, this is testable. It's up to the buyer to decide if they want to move forward or not. Here's a situation. Let's say the seller is only selling because the house doesn't meet their needs anymore. But if they could build a brand new house on this same lot, they love their neighborhood. They love their neighbors. They don't want to leave. But the house just doesn't fit. There's maybe too small or maybe too big. Something about it they just can't deal with. That's the only reason they're selling. And let's paint as happy as a picture as we possibly could for a house to be destroyed. They're out. Maybe they moved it all out. It's vacant. They didn't lose any pets or people or belongings. And they went on a trip and the house burned down. And they're actually happy about it. But they're under contract. And they say, oh, great, kind of. The house burned down. We didn't lose anything. Let's just cash out and get our money from the insurance policy, and we'll build a nice new house in the same place that we didn't want to leave to begin with. It's not for them to decide that. That seller cannot just say, great, we don't want to honor this contract anymore, buyer. We're not under contract anymore because it burned down. That is not the truth. They are under contract. And when a property is destroyed, when it's under contract, it's still under contract. And the decision to move forward or not, it's the buyer's. So that seller might be sad to find out, oh, wait a minute. You mean I don't get to build the new house to replace the one that burned? No, you have to wait and see if the buyer wants to buy it or not. The buyer might not like the house. They like the location. The buyer might be happy. Oh, wow, we didn't really like that house anyway, but we love the neighborhood. Hey, seller, give us the proceeds of your insurance policy, honor the contract, and we'll just build what we want with those proceeds. So, testable question, who makes the decision to move forward in the event of the property being destroyed? The buyer. Got to wait and see what the buyer wants to do. Or they could decide not to. Maybe it's not good for them to have to do all the many things they're going to have to do to wait for the property to be rebuilt. So, but it's up to them. What our standard contract says, it's the seller's risk. If it burns, if it gets destroyed during contract period. Let's see. We talked about early or late possession by the parties already. I won't belabor that point, but we need to advise them. Hey, make sure you maintain the proper coverage and use the right forms to make this thing, to accomplish this thing. Flood stuff. Areas bordering rivers and streams tend to be in flood hazard areas, more likely that if it rains for a couple days, maybe the waters go above the banks of the river, maybe the stream, and gets close to the property or even touches the house, like the pictures I showed you from my agent friend. And FEMA has maps that show these flood hazard areas. The point of the National Flood Insurance Program through FEMA is a federally related loan is to be used for properties within those areas, has to comply with National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, to reduce the impact of these flooding phenomena that happen. Flooding insurance rates don't differ company to company either. Different companies are going to have the same rates. Just who do you want to work with in the event of a situation? They look for the year, building occupancy, the number of floors, the flood zone. All of this stuff is looked at in determining the amount paid for a flood insurance policy. And any federally related mortgage loan requires flood insurance in a high-risk zone that FEMA has determined to be high risk. Lenders could waive the flood insurance requirement if they are given documentation by FEMA saying the property is not in a 100-year floodplain. 100-year floodplain does not mean it only floods every 100 years. It means it is more prone to flooding because of where it's situated. And flooding, another testable thing for you is that the flood insurance policy is separate from the homeowner's policy. It's a different animal. And then finally, our responsibility as brokers, avoid misrepresentation on what you can do with the property, recognize the potential use problems of the land. And we have a duty to discover and disclose any of these problems. We need to look for red flags. We need to look for patent signs of flooding on a property. It might be that the fence has marks on it from water rising, or the grass or the land looks particularly eroded. Anytime there's a river or creek on the property, I'm going to assume it might be in a floodplain and look into it just because of that. And we need to help the parties, buyer, seller, to look up the FEMA maps, check with planning office, see if there's any sort of potential flood problem, because it is on our shoulders to disclose that material fact. That's it. Let's see. Let's compare that with the syllabus and finish up there. Here we go. All that is what we just talked about. FEMA, the 100-year floodplain. A flood has a 1% chance of equaling or exceeding the map elevation any given year. Not that it's going to flood every 100 years. Talked about clue. Talked about unoccupied versus vacant. There we go. Okay. We already talked about taxation. Never give tax advice. We know that. Okay. Let's talk about capital gains. Yeah, let's do that one. We'll do the taxation chapter next. Here we go. So this is Unit 18. Taxation. It involves capital gains tax. What happens if you sell primary residence and you earn more than $250,000 in capital gain and you're single? Then you have to pay tax on that over and above the $250,000. We're going to talk about that sort of thing in this chapter. There are also some tax deductible items when you're a homeowner. That's one of the reasons that we counsel renters on why they should not rent but should own instead. It's one of the benefits of owning. So we'll do that and then get into calculating capital gain problems as well. We need to have just enough understanding to point them to a tax advisor. We need to know the basics about capital gains tax, but we would never really do the calculation for them and say, hey, here's what your tax is on the gain. They need to talk to their advisor. They need to talk to a tax person, a CPA. When someone buys a house, there are some tax deductible loan expenses. Mortgage interest on a primary residence and a secondary home is tax deductible. Mortgage interest, the interest on the loan. And by the way, you're paying mostly interest with those first payments all the way up through the first 15 years. The majority of your mortgage payment is the interest. So mortgage interest is tax deductible. Also, if you paid something called discount points, that's something we'll learn more about in the closing chapter, but it basically lets you buy your interest rate down. If you pay some money up front, called discount points, instead of having to make your payment based on a 7% rate, which it might be today, you could buy it down to a 6.5% rate or anything less than 7, right? And if that's what it takes to get your monthly payment to something that fits in your budget and you have a chunk of money available to you, maybe from your parents, grandma, grandpa, a tax refund, or just savings, you could use that money, or maybe the seller gives you some incentives, some credits from the seller to pay and buy down your interest rate. Maybe that's what it takes for that seller to get the house sold, because buyers are not buying quite as much as they were because the rates are higher than they were, double. Maybe this gets a buyer off the fence. That seller says, look, buyer, you don't want to buy it because you're scared of the rate. Well, how about I buy the rate down to something that does work for you? And that's a discount point, or a couple of them. And so if you did pay discount points when you bought it, that's another tax deductible item. If you have paid prepayment penalties, you paid your mortgage off early. Well, the lender doesn't like it when you pay things off early because they are making you the loan because they want to collect interest over time. So if you pay early, then you have to pay a penalty sometimes for some types of loans, not all. If it does have a prepayment penalty, they have to tell you it has one. But if it does and you paid it, then that's another potential tax deductible item. Your mortgage insurance, we'll talk more about that later, but private mortgage insurance, for instance, covers the lender if you have less than 20% down payment on the property. You've got to take out an insurance policy called private mortgage insurance to benefit the lender in case you actually stop paying your mortgage. And so those private mortgage or any sort of mortgage insurance premiums are also tax deductible. And then the most common administration fee that you have to pay when you get a mortgage is a loan origination fee. It's quite often like 1% of the loan amount, for instance, just to give you an idea. All of these things are potentially tax deductible. I say potentially because I don't want to go out on a limb and say things that a tax advisor should say. So you don't tell your client either. You say, hey, client, these are potentially tax deductible. Talk to your CPA or tax advisor for your own situation. But that's all the benefit. This little bundle down here would apply just in the first year. You don't get to apply them over the entire life of the loan. You paid them in the first year when you bought it so that you will get those deductions then. Real property taxes are also a deduction on both the principal and the second residence. So between the mortgage interest and the property tax, you've got some tax savings that makes it worthwhile to consider owning versus renting, that we can talk about, brag about, help people understand, look, why are you still renting? Here's what you could see. And you could crunch the numbers and show them how this might affect their taxes, but mainly we're going to always point them to their tax advisor. Okay, those are the deductible items. Let's talk about what happens when you make money on your property. Say you bought it for $100,000. Let's just make it super simple and then we'll fill in the blanks. But when you bought it, $100,000, what you paid. There's some things you have to subtract and add, and we'll see that later. But then fast forward, let's say 10 years. I just picked that number. And now you're selling it. And you're selling it for $650,000. Again, I just pulled that number from air. What is your gain, roughly? You do have to factor in some other costs involved, but we'll get into that in a minute. But roughly,
550.
yeah, you gained $550,000. Not quite, because we have to allow for things like capital improvements and broker commission and closing costs, and we'll see how that affects it later. But paying tax on the gain. If your gain is $550,000, here's the good news. You don't have to pay tax on all of that, $550,000. Here's the rules. If you're single or married filing separately, then you just have to pay tax on the amount over $250,000 of gain. So in this case, what is that? $300,000. You'd be paying capital gains tax on $300,000 if you're single. If you're really into someone and are thinking about marrying them, go ahead and do it, because then you get to deduct in excess of $500,000 of the gain. So whatever that gain is over 500, in this case 50. So now you're paying tax on 50 compared to 300. Maybe it's worth it. Go ahead and propose. Go ahead and get married. Get that done. It's financial. Perfectly honorable. I'm just kidding. Okay, let's see what it looks like. It's a little more complicated than that, but let's see what's involved with this capital gains tax concept. It's a profit or a loss. A gain is a profit, a loss is a loss, but it's profit on the sale of a capital asset, real estate, real property. If it's considered a long-term capital gain, that means you owned it for more than 12 months. If you were just keeping it for a short time to flip it maybe, and you did so, you're going to have to pay a different percentage for taxation because it's a short-term capital gain. If you owned it 12 months or less, then instead of paying a maximum of 20% taxes on that gain, you're going to have to pay whatever your bracket is. What's your ordinary tax bracket? And that may be worse, right? But 20% is not terrible. Again, we're getting in the weeds a little bit, so point them to their tax advisor. But just so you know, a long-term capital gain tax rate. So let's say it was that situation where you're married and it's a gain of $50,000 that you have to pay taxes on. 20% of $50,000. That's what we're talking about. So $10,000 tax. Or you can't quite bring yourself to marry the person. So now our gain instead of 50 is 300. What's 20% of 300? 60,000 instead of the 10,000. So that's what we're talking about. Maximum 20% tax on a long-term capital gains. Or again, if it's 12 months or less, your tax will be based on whatever your normal tax rate is. So when it comes to calculating this thing, it's a little more than what I showed you on the iPad just now. Let's see what extra things are involved. Your basis is what we call the purchase price back when you bought it. The adjusted basis is the purchase price plus the fact that you had to pay some closing costs, plus you paid for some improvements to the property over time. So let's say your closing costs were like $5,000. Your improvements were Maybe you added a $20,000 room of some sort. So to go back to our example before, here we go. Paid 100 plus, let's say, 5,000 for closing costs, plus 20,000 for various improvements, not upkeep, not maintenance, but improvements. So we have $125,000 as your adjusted basis. So it starts there. So rather than subtract 100 from the 650, we're going to be subtracting 125 from whatever this number is over here. By the way, it's not just 650 over here. Let's see what else is involved. Fast forward to whenever you do sell it. Years later, maybe months later, some future date, the sale price. This time you're going to subtract the closing costs that it cost you when you sold it. Let's say your various closing costs were $3,000, and then also brokerage commission. And let's say that greedy broker wanted you to pay him $16,000 for commissions. That, when you subtract those amounts from the sale price, gives you your amount realized. Amount realized. And so to go along with our example, 650 is what you sold it for. Subtract 3,000 for the closing cost. Subtract the 16 for the brokerage commission, and that is what I think 631. Let's see if that's right. 650 minus 3. So our amount realized is 631. Their adjusted basis is 125. What do we do next? We take that amount realized and we subtract the adjusted basis from it. And that gives us either our gain or our loss, hopefully a gain. But in our case, we're going to subtract this 631, take that 125 from it, and that gives us a gain of $506,000. That's a good number because it fits nicely with the next question that I've already run by you. But in this case, the question is married or single, because that has to do with how much of this gain you will not be taxed on. If you're married, you won't be taxed on 500,000 of that gain. If you're single, you won't be taxed on 250,000 of that gain. So if you're married, another way to say that is you'll be taxed on $6,000. If you're single, you'll be taxed on, what is that, 256? We good? So
I'd hate for that to be a reason to be.
it's not good enough, or is it good enough? Okay. So again, for investment property, the adjusted basis plus closing costs plus capital improvements, also plus special assessments, and then subtract out any payments for insurance claims or receipts for selling an easement. So different things. You don't need to know this part, but for investment property, it's calculated a little differently. You factor in different things to get that adjusted basis. Here's the other thing. You have to have lived there for 24 out of 60 months. People say 2 out of 5 years, but they go down to the month. Let's say you lived there for the first year, 12 months. Then you moved away with a job for a couple of years. And then you came back and lived there for 6 more months. What are we up to? 18 months? And then you moved away for another year. As long as the total of the last 5 years had you living there for 24 months out of those 60 potential months, then all this applies. This works if you've lived there 24 out of 60 months. And then again, there it is. There's the amount you get to not pay taxes on: $250 for single or filing separate, or $500 if you're married. So let's look at a couple of questions about this. What if in the math that they give you, maybe instead of 506, let's get rid of this. Maybe instead of 506, these numbers up here, forget what they are right now, but let's say they came up to 497,000, and you're married. How much is your capital gains tax on this situation?
0.
That's it. Yeah. You're exempt because it didn't even hit the 500. So in this case, a married person owes no capital gains tax. What if you're single? How much are you paying capital gains tax in this situation if you're single?
247.
Yeah. Tax on 247. The difference between 497 and 250 is paying tax on 247. Next question is, how long did you have it? Longer than 12 months? Then you get to pay it on the maximum 20% capital gains tax rate. So what's your tax burden going to be in this situation? If your taxable gain is 247,000. Just going to multiply that by the 20%. So your taxable gain, $49,400. Because it's a long-term capital gain because of having owned it for longer than 12 months. What if it's the other option? What if it was a short-term capital gain? You only owned it for 9 months. And let's say your tax rate is 33% because you're selling a bunch of houses. You're a big shot. Well, there it is. 247 times 33. 81. That's a good problem to have. I would rather have this problem. Please tax me more because it means I'm making more money, right? Kind of. So that's the scope of what you might have to do with this problem. Understand the difference in married and single. Understand how to calculate adjusted basis by adding in the closing cost and the improvements. And then also the amount realized by subtracting the closing cost this time and subtracting the brokerage commission, and then subtracting them from each other, one from the other, to get the capital gain. And then what's the situation? Married, single, what's the tax on it? They might ask you any of that possible stuff. That's the gist of it. It doesn't get more complicated than that, though. Other tax issues you might run into, if it's a seller finance property, an installment sale means you're paying the seller as if they are the bank. So seller financing is an installment land contract. And for installment sales, the taxation happens a little differently. We'll see that in a minute. We'll talk about vacation homes as well as 1031 tax deferred exchanges, a great thing to do as an investor, and some home office tax exemptions too. Seller financing, what you need to know here is you can, because you're making your house payment over time, payment in years other than the sales, the seller is receiving payment instead of a lump sum at the time they're selling the property. They're receiving it in the years to come. And so your tax gets spread out over that time. How much did you make in payments and interest year 1, year 2, year 3? That affects your taxation over time. So seller financing installment sales involves lowering your year of sale taxes because you get to spread them out. Home office deduction, it's more strict than just, hey, I sat in front of the TV watching the game with a laptop and I did some real estate calls. Not enough, right? The property, the amount of space in your property has to be exclusively for an office, principal place of business, clients can meet there, separate structure. There's a lot of elements here. It's not just a forgiving and simple, hey, I can deduct my entire living room amount of space and all the utilities because the living room is 20% of the whole house. I can deduct the utilities of 20%. It's got to follow certain guidelines to be included as a properly given home office deduction. Talk to your tax advisor. Vacation homes. The thing about this is it better really be a vacation home, mostly used by other people, not you. So some deductions could be disallowed if you use it more than 14 days or more than 10% of the rented time. So you got to follow and keep records and keep track of these sorts of things so that you get deductions that you can possibly get. Like-kind exchange. So while the capital gains stuff is nice for when you own something, a like-kind exchange or a 1031 exchange is for investors or people owning property for business purposes. Like-kind. Well, let me tell you the benefit. How about this? You could just not pay the taxes on the gain. You buy a duplex today, you sell it in 3 years because you want to upgrade to an apartment complex of like, say, 10 units, and then you keep that for 10 years and you upgrade and sell for a building of 100 units, and then you keep that and you never pay capital gains tax on any of it. That's what this can accomplish for you, because eventually you die and you didn't have to pay capital gains because you used a 1031 like-kind exchange to defer your taxes indefinitely until you died, and your heirs didn't have to deal with it either in certain cases. So that's the plus. That's why to go through it. That's why to bother with it, because you do have to do it in a certain way. It involves a time frame. Well, you don't have to get it too much into this, but it's good to learn for when you're out there in the wild. Get ready for investors because they're going to know this and they're going to want to do it. If it's for investment purposes or business purposes, it applies and it's eligible. You have to exchange it for similar things. Like kind doesn't mean it has to be a duplex for a duplex. It's more forgiving than that. It just means you can't be exchanging the duplex for a fleet of motorcycles or guitars or cars. It's got to be real estate for real estate. That's it. So you could start with a single family rental house and exchange that for an apartment building. It's real estate. And when we say the word exchange, we don't mean that you literally have to find somebody with a property that you want to trade for. It's definitely more forgiving than that too. That would be horrible because what are the odds? Not good. Exchange, though, does require that you identify the property within a certain number of days and then close on the property within a certain number of days. You're still basically selling it, but somebody, a specialist called a like-kind exchange specialist, has to navigate it for you. By the way, that is not us as brokers. We're in the mix. We could be a part of this process because we help them locate the property. We help them find a buyer for what they want to exchange out of. But for handling, this is a tax thing, right? So someone versed in taxation, specifically 1031 exchanges, has to be the one that they use to help them navigate that and make sure, did we comply with locating the potential property within the certain number of days? Did we actually close? Someone else is helping them with that stuff. We're just continuing to help them with the real estate side of things. But a like-kind exchange specialist has to be involved. Now, an actual exchange, that goes back to the number of days you have to do this stuff. It could get tricky. So what if in the number of days you are given to identify a property, you just can't? Because in a market like we're in, that's a very real possibility. There's not a lot of inventory. And if you can't, guess what? The worst case scenario, you're paying taxes on this gain. That's pretty worst case scenario, but that's what you don't lose the property, you don't get shot, and you don't get arrested, but you're having to now pay tax on this thing. That's the motivation for complying. And I talked to somebody who's a big time investor recently, and he said, I always identify at least 3 potential properties to go in the paperwork in case one of them sells before I can get it accomplished. So that's sort of a little trick of the trade, right? And so what's happening here is it's not a tax-free exchange, it's a deferral of the tax. But again, you could just defer and defer and defer. What happens if the one that you want to trade up to is actually not up? In other words, you're selling a $300,000 property, but the only thing you can find that works is a $250,000 property. You're going to have extra money in hand, and that money is called boot. The extra cash received left over because the thing you were moving to is not as much as the thing you were moving from, meaning for investment property, is taxable. That boot is taxable. So you want to try to find something that uses up all of the resources, all the entire gain. But because if it doesn't, that's what'll happen. You're taxed. That's about it for what this class requires you to know about it. Let's take a look at the syllabus. And again, there's this formula to remember, but let's look at it in the syllabus.
Quick question, Neil.
Yeah, sure.
As far as the capital gain you would receive from the like-kind exchange, is what you were referring to specifically for the monies that you gain to purchase another property? So it wouldn't be just you deciding that you wanted to buy one, it's you actually buying using the gain.
Right. Well, you have to use all of what you make on the property to buy the next one. You have to roll all of that in so that you're not paying taxes on the sale. It's a better way to say it. Let's see. We talked about income taxation, never give tax advice. We talked about the deductions. We saw that in the slide. Taxes and mortgage interest and discount points, if you use those. We'll talk more about what those are later. And it's principal residence was the whole adjusted basis amount realized thing. Oh, yeah, you won't have to do the math, but you do need to know the relationship of the money, of what is amount realized versus adjusted basis. What makes for an eligible property is a property that you've lived in 24 out of the previous 60 months. Basis is what you bought it for. Adjusted basis is what you bought it for, plus the closing costs, plus the capital improvements. Capital improvement is not maintenance. Oh, I had to get it painted the 5th year. That's not capital improvement. Oh, but I put a extra garage on it. That's a capital improvement, meaning it improved the asset, made it worth more. And then the thing you sold it, the amount you sold it for is you subtract from that the closing cost and the brokerage commission to get the amount realized. You just need to know these definitions. If that's a positive number, when you subtract adjusted basis from amount realized, then what you have is a gain. If it's a negative number, then you lost money. That's a capital loss, not a capital gain. Married or filing jointly is a $500,000 exemption. It's just paying tax on the gain over and above that. Single or separately filing, $250,000. And this again, primary residence for 2 of the last 5 or 24 of the last 60 months. And you can do this once every 2 years. We talked about these 3 or 4 things, just the basic concept of a seller finance or installment sale versus 1031 versus vacation home versus a office in the home. And that's it. That's a super simple, limited chapter or sections, like 30 or 45 minutes, I think, required. So that is taxation. Let's see. Okay. We're still continuing on down. We talked about environmental already and land use control. So we're just filling in the blanks here in the syllabus because we've already done this part. And we talked about estates too. Freehold, leasehold. Well, not much in leasehold. Oh, yeah. This new syllabus, they have that coming up. Let's talk about landlord tenant stuff. We'll fill in that blank. Then that's ownership and severalty and hybrid. We did all that. And all this we've done. We've come a long way. Deed stuff, special warranty. And then that fills in everything. After we talk about landlord tenant chapter, the next thing is contracts. So we'll be getting into a big chapter possibly tonight. Because I think usually like we used to do landlord tenant and then property management, those two chapters back to back, but now they have it split up in the syllabus because property management is a type of agency. It's a thing you do with a client. Landlord tenant could have no agents involved at all. But property management definitely has an agent involved because you are one to be a property manager, right? So let's go ahead and do our break. And then when we come back, we will hit the landlord tenant chapter. See you back here in 10. Right, let's wake up. Hopefully you stood up. Got a little blood flow going. It's that time of night where these sorts of things make it a little more challenging, as I'm all by myself at the moment. Here we go. Okay, good. Okay. By the way, side note, guys, in case I didn't make it clear, I think I did, but just so you know what happens behind the scenes of this whole class course deal, Zoom tracks your attendance. Zoom shows me how many minutes you are logged in. So at the end of class every night, I'd stay behind and do a couple things and fill out a report. And so that means I have to pull the Zoom report and see, Alfred was here for, I believe the magic number is 240 minutes or more per session. That's good. That means you didn't miss any minutes. If you were 235, I've got to write it down. Oh, missed 5 minutes. And at the end of all of our time, the spreadsheet says, therefore, this person has missed 957 minutes. The maximum allowable to miss, I believe it's like 1,000 and something. It's like 1,050 minutes. So this is not casual. I say all that to say this, and I'm probably not talking to people that need to hear it right now, but you guys have been great. There are some, not in this class, but other classes that are always pushing. And so around the 3/4 of the course mark, I have to reach out and say, look, you've got like 4 more classes and you've missed 1,037 minutes. You can't even miss another whole class. So that's a part of this whole thing. That's a requirement that you attend a certain minimum number of minutes to be able, you won't even be allowed to take the final exam if you miss more than that maximum number allowed. So that's kind of how this whole thing works. I didn't want to go without making sure I address that. I think at this point, everybody's fine. But I will let you know if I see some things getting kind of in the red or getting crazy looking. So let's move on to this unit, landlord tenant. Remember when we talked about fee simple absolute and life estates and fee simple defeasible? Well, those were types of freehold estates. Freehold estates. Now we're talking about non-freehold estates or leasehold estates. What is it like when you don't own it, but you get to use it? You have a right of possession, right? So you don't have ownership. You don't get to refinance it. You don't get to borrow against it because you're not an owner, but you get to come there at the end of the day and sleep there, right? You get to stay there. You're paying for the lease term to possess it. So we're going to look at different characteristics of lots of different leases, what the 4 main types of leasehold estates are, the purpose and various types of leases there are, like ground leases and mineral leases, and what are some common provisions in a standard valid lease. There are some acts, legislation, laws in place to protect landlords, tenants, and agents too. And so they involve, as you would imagine, safety. How do we make sure people are safe, keep the property safe and habitable? And one of them, the main one, is the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreements Act. We'll dig into that more when we get to the property. No, it's this one. Yeah, it's this one. So it's about, does the landlord fix things in time? Does the tenant let the landlord know that things are broken in time? Keeping things fit and safe and habitable, free of rodents, free of infestation, free of tripping hazards and wires that got exposed, get things fixed in a reasonable time. If it's a rental that is a short-term situation, a vacation rental, in other words, you're staying there for 3 days or a week, time is even more crucial. How long does it take to evict someone if they have a 12-month lease? The eviction process can drag out for a while, and somebody who knows the laws and rules could really stay in place and not pay their rent and probably still live there for at least 60, 90 days if they know to show up to court, make promises they'll do better, and then never intend to do better. They could drag it out because they know how to work the system. With vacation rentals, all that, including the eviction process, has to go much quicker because we're only talking about 3 days, 2 days, a week at the most, something like that. So we'll talk about the Vacation Rental Act. What are the rights of tenants in public housing? When it's public housing, paid for in part or in full by the government? And then what are the rights of tenants under fair housing laws, discrimination concerns? I would dare say that discrimination against people in protected classes might, if we looked at stats, my guess, might happen more frequently in property management, landlord-tenant situations than it does in a sale. Because even the most bigoted person, when they sell, at the end of the day, they want their money and they're gone. But if it's a rental, they might continue to exercise their prejudice because they don't want so-and-so living there, right? So I think the fair housing issues, the fair housing laws get broken quite a bit in rental situations. So we'll also look at the major provisions of the North Carolina Association of Realtors standard form. They give us a lease that we can use with our clients if we need to. It's about 16 pages. It's a lot of words, not a lot of blanks, by the way. There's a lot of fill in the blanks on a purchase for sale. That's redundant. But on a lease, there's a lot of words covering a lot of issues. We don't have to read the whole thing. I'll just point out some highlights to you. So a lease, what is a lease? It's nothing more than a contract. It's a contract for possession. You get to own it, you get to use it, not own it, right? It's not ownership. And so it involves two kinds of interests, right? It involves a freehold estate because the owner of the rental property has some sort of maybe a fee simple absolute or fee simple determinable, defeasible, or a life estate. They could rent any of those kinds of ownership whichever way they own it, it's possible that they could rent it. It's just that if it's fee simple defeasible, we're going to have to disclose to the tenant, look, it's all well and good as long as you don't use it in a certain way that's not allowed. And if it's a life estate, we have to tell the tenant, look, you'll get to rent it from me as long as so-and-so measuring life remains alive. Or just disclose, right? Disclose to them what the limitations are. But what we have going on with the situation is both a freehold estate, the owner's interest in it, and a non-freehold estate, the tenant's possessory interest. We've got, doesn't last a lifetime. It's not ownership. It's just the right to use it. There's 4 main kinds of leasehold estates or non-freehold estates. An estate for years, a periodic or a period to period, and then the other 2. I'm going to go backwards. Let me flip ahead a little bit, and let's talk about an estate at sufferance because it's the easiest to understand. All it really is, it's not good. You're not supposed to be there. The tenant is staying longer than they were supposed to. The parties are not happy. It's an unfriendly lease situation. They didn't move out at the end of the lease period. They stopped paying their rent. They are now there illegally. So an estate at sufferance, not good. It's not a happy face, frowny face. They are a holdover tenant. their lease has expired. It's one of these three things. It's either the lease has expired and they've refused to move out, so they're now called a holdover tenant, or the owner has been foreclosed on and they refuse to vacate. They are now in what's called an estate at sufferance. This isn't a tenant-landlord situation, but it's called an estate at sufferance if somebody is there when they shouldn't be. It could also be an owner whose property has been taken through eminent domain and refuses to leave, like the entire property. Taken, they were paid fair market value, but they're not happy and they're staying. So B and C is not your typical rental situation, but it's someone staying there when they're supposed to have already left. By the way, little nuance here. When it comes to court, we go to court over it. If the landlord has accepted any payment of rent in this situation, tenancy is legally considered having been recreated. And so that changes things. That now extends things. And now that tenant gets to stay there for some amount of time. So that's one of the things that the landlord might do wrong. A rookie landlord that doesn't know any better, or owner, might just be glad to get some money, and they take the money, but now they've given up their opportunity to get this person out of there as quickly as they had hoped. So again, unfriendly. Person has stopped paying rent. When it applies to a rental situation, it's this. They've stayed past their lease term and they're not paying rent anymore. Another super simple one is a happy version, a friendly lease. It's an estate at will. An estate at will means it's usually informal. The landlord's saying, look, I'll let you rent from me, and I might need you to go ahead and move out because I'm trying to sell it. And you're not going to get mad at me for asking you to move out. And the tenant's like, oh, yeah, that's fine with me. I just need a place for a little while, and I don't want to sign anything. It could actually be oral, not in writing. The tenant could say, I just need a place to get me between the thing I just sold and the thing I'm going to buy, and it won't be available for a few more weeks, months. Can I be here now? The landlord might say, yeah, sure, no big deal. They might both need it to be temporary, and the landlord might say, well, I'm trying to sell it, so you can stay here as long as it takes me to get it sold under contract or closed. The tenant says, okay, no big deal. Informal agreement. Either one can terminate. This is the key. Either one can terminate without notice. We're going to boil the other two down based on who can terminate. And so an estate at will, either party can terminate without notice, and they're not mad about it. An estate at sufferance, what we just looked at, has already been terminated, and the person is staying past their welcome. Now, with these two easy ones out of the way, let's look at the ones that can be a little confusing. An estate for years and an estate from period to period. I hate these names. I wish I could change them because they're dumb. So estate for years might also be known as an estate from year to year. But even though the word year is in it, doesn't necessarily mean a full year or more. It just means some amount of time. So if I could just start up a committee and rename this thing, I'd probably call it an estate for time. But it's not a thing. It's got to be known this way, so learn it this way. An estate for years just means any period of time. Not the actual length. So it's either years, months, weeks, or days. What really matters is this, that there is a definite ending date and a definite beginning date. We say we're starting on August 3rd and we're ending on December 31st. Some sort of a definite beginning date and ending date. Here's the other big important thing. It terminates with no notice required. Why does it need notice if they've put in a definite ending date, right? That's how I remember it. It's like, well, of course no notice is required. You already know when you have to be out of there because the lease has to have both a beginning and an ending specified and definite, right? So those might be kind of helpful. And then no automatic renewal. Guess what? You don't get to just stay past the last date. You will be considered a holdover tenant unless you specifically renewed extra, right? And took those steps. But Just because you stayed and didn't address it doesn't mean you've automatically renewed. You're not allowed to. There is no automatic renewal in an estate for years situation. So that's an estate for years. An estate from period to period means there's a definite initial period of time in the lease. This one, you have to give notice to terminate it. So it's going to keep going unless you say otherwise. What does that sound like in real life? How about any residential lease you've ever heard of, right? You say it's going to be here. I'm going to be here for a year. They don't kick you out at 12 months. They say, you want to keep going? And you're like, yeah, okay. Okay. Keep sending us the rent. Great. So an estate from period to period, if no notice is given, it will renew automatically if you don't give notice. In other words, if you want to leave, you got to tell them you're leaving. It requires notice to terminate. What if, now sometimes this residential lease situation gets to that 12th month or whatever the end date after that period of time is, and then you turn into a month to month. That might be a thing at a higher amount, quite likely too, by the way. So here's the thing about period to period. There's a minimum amount of notice required to terminate this lease. You can't just terminate with an hour's notice. You got to give them a bare minimum amount, and it depends on how long the lease is for. So, under North Carolina law, the minimum notice required to terminate is, if it's a week-to-week kind of lease where you're paying weekly, you got to give at least 2 days notice that this lease is dead, it's ending. If it's a month-to-month that you're collecting rent, month-to-month lease, then you have to give them at least a week, 7 days. And if it's a year-to-year, then you have to give them at least 30 days notice. So the amount of minimum time of notice to give them to terminate the lease depends on the length of the lease. There's another factor that depends on the length of the lease. What is involved in a rental situation, by the way, with money? It's not just the rent. What's the other chunk of money involved when you rent a property?
Your down payment or first month's rent or something like that.
There's that, but then there's another thing for damage situation. In case you damage it. What's that word?
Renter's insurance?
Not quite. You've got to pay something along with maybe the first and last month's rent, but there's another chunk of money that you have to pay. In case you damage it, they have money they can pull from.
Security deposit.
Yeah, that's the one. And if we look back in the first part of this, it's not in there. There's another act called the Tenant Security Deposit Act that dictates how much you're allowed to collect. Wouldn't it be nice if you could just say, hey, you know what? My place I'm renting to you is pretty special, and I don't know you, so I want to collect $20,000 for a tenant security deposit. Well, first of all, good luck finding a tenant who has and is willing to do it. You can't do it. When it's an estate from period to period, it depends on the length of the lease as to how much you can collect for the tenant security deposit maximum, and how much time you have to give them to give as notice to terminate. Both of those things depend on the length of the lease. And we're going to see the security deposit one in just a second. We talked about an estate at will. We talked about an estate at sufferance and other kinds of leases. We've got we have a broker's license. When you accomplish all this, get through this, pass that final exam, pass the Pearson exam, you'll have a broker's license. What are you authorized to sell and do, and what are some real estate things that license gives you permission to do that you need the license for? Selling, that's one. What else? Selling residential property. What else?
Property management,
Yeah, property management. What else can you sell? Help someone buy and sell besides residential?
commercial,
Commercial. And land too. Land, by the way, if somebody ever said, if the test question was ever, which is the most complicated, potentially complicated type of property to sell as a broker, land is the most complicated because there's so many moving parts, variables, there's EPA considerations and zoning and all kinds of things. Deceptively complex. But commercial is another specialty in this business that actually quite often involves both a sale and rental stuff. As a commercial agent, you're going to need to be familiar with commercial leases because that's why someone owns commercial property. They're not owning it probably to flip it as much as they're owning it to rent it out or to sell it to somebody that wants to rent it out for that long-term passive income. So some other kinds of lease types have to do with commercial property too. A fixed lease means the landlord is paying the expenses and the tenant is paying the rent only. Fixed lease, just the rent, the utilities, the other expenses covered by the landlord. A percentage lease, here's two of them. Here's two very commonly tested questions. When it's a percentage lease, what is the tenant paying? They're paying based on a portion of their income. In commercial real estate, let's say you're a hair salon and you have a percentage lease. It might say, and the test question might say, this hair salon is agreed to pay a rental amount of a base $5,000 per month. I'm pulling these from air. I don't even know if they're realistic. And then an additional 10% of the profit over whatever they earn in excess of, let's say, $10,000 a month. So if the business, hair salon, makes $11,000 a month, then they're going to have to pay a little more in rent. It might look like this. The base rent is $5,000. They're paying that no matter what. They're also going to have to pay an additional 10% for any profit that was earned that month over $10,000. So if the hair salon or the restaurant or whoever made $12,000, then that means what's the difference over 10? That's $2,000 times 10%. $200. So it'll be not 5,000, but 5,000 plus the 200. These numbers are probably way off, but the idea is the same. It's probably a base, but it's also a percentage of the profit or the income. Might be entirely about the income or the profit, but oftentimes it's a base plus. So what is a percentage lease based on? It's based on income or profit. The tenant paying a portion or all of the rent based on a portion of the income or profit that they earn. That's a percentage lease. Another kind of lease they could test you on is a net lease. Net means, think about operating expenses. I always kind of laugh and roll my eyes. I've been in the business long enough that when an agent makes a billboard, runs a billboard ad or any kind of ad in the paper or online, they say, I'm $1 million producer. You ever seen that? A real estate agent says, I'm a $10 million producer. My skeptical self says, yeah, but how much did you net? I'm not impressed that you sold $10 million of real estate if you had to spend so much on 45 different buyer agents and that fancy rent of that building you work out of, and you pay $10,000 a month to Zillow for leads and this and that and the other and the other. And if all you net is 30 grand at the end of the year, then I would have rather just been by myself and sold enough real estate to end up with a bigger net than that. It's not how much you make, it's how much you net, right? So net lease is based on a portion of your expenses. You pay your rent based on a portion of paying the expenses. TICAM is a popular acronym in commercial real estate. And those expenses are this: taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance. That's what TICAM stands for. Taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance. So with a net lease, the tenant is paying a portion of the expenses. So if the test question says, with a percentage lease, what is the tenant paying? It gives you 4 choices. One of the choices is paying a percentage of their profit, or paying a portion of expenses, or paying based on minerals pulled out of the ground, or paying based on living there. I don't know, some other 4th answer. You're looking for, if it's a percentage lease, they're paying a portion of income or profit. If it's a net lease, they're paying a portion of the expenses, taxes, insurance, common area maintenance. That includes power, utilities, water, all that sort of thing. A graduated lease means that we're letting the tenant have a chance to get some sales, right? To get some money, to make a little money along the way. Maybe they're just brand new business and they're going to make less this year, and they're probably going to make a little more next year, a little more after that, and they're going to grow. And so the landlord is saying, look, I'll give you a chance to pay a lower rent the first year when you're probably making the least. But then it's going to go up, because that second year you're going to be better at what you do and have more clients and make more. And so a graduated lease means the rent is going up in predetermined intervals. And it's typically used in multiple year situations for office space, not just a 12-month lease, but a multiple year lease, also known as a step-up lease. Another kind of lease is a ground lease, and that's as simple as it looks. You're leasing the dirt. You're leasing the ground only. You want a building? You got to pay for that building. That tenant buys and pays for the construction of the building, but only rents the land. Oftentimes, it's a very long term, because if you're building a $1 million building on this dirt, you better be okay and confident that you're going to be allowed to stay there a long time, right? What sort of situation can you think of where you actually own the structure but you rent the land it's sitting on in terms of residential? Any folks grew up in the country in this room? And maybe you drive by the mobile home park. A lot of the mobile home parks operate this way. People that live in there might actually own the double wide mobile home, but they're only renting the lot, the dirt that it sits on. Well, this also applies in a lot of commercial situations. It's also something that they do in other countries a little more. I've heard of like a church trying to raise money to build a church building, but in that country, I forgot which one it was in this case, but they have a 99-year lease for the ground, for the dirt. And they were trying to raise money to put a building on that. They'll own the building, but they're just renting. They're just leasing the land for a long term. The federal government sometimes, at least in the past, would sign a 99-year lease for something like a post office building. They're going to use it for the post office. They're going to own and build the building to their specs, but the dirt is not owned by them. They just sign a long-term lease, ground lease, to put a building of their choosing on it to operate from. A full-service lease means the commercial tenants are sharing the common area expenses. Remember the CAM in TICAM, common area expenses? It's usually like a larger building, multiple tenant situation. You have a base rent plus a per person or pro rata share of the complex's operating expenses. So it might be something that, let's see here, if I can pull that real quick. When I was teaching in person more, which is any amount because I don't teach in person at all now, I taught out of this building. we go. And if you're in Huntersville, North Carolina, and go to exit 23, you'll get to this attractive complex of buildings that look like this. There's only a couple of them, but what is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe like 5 stories, I believe. This big center section is the elevator lobby. And so when you walk in the doors, it looks great, right? The elevator doors are shiny chrome, and it's all latest and greatest, modern looking and super streamlined. And I think the entire top floor was leased by like one of those, let's see, what is it? Like Phoenix Online University, that kind of a school, where it's like basically a correspondence school or an online school. And then the rest of them were individual suites, or there was the real estate office. This is where I worked out of, because they let us use their conference room for teaching classes, because they were hoping that when you guys graduated that you might consider joining their firm. There was also a medical, I think it was like a lady doctor kind of a something or other, and they were on the ground floor. And I remember some of the other tenants were concerned because there was no bathroom in their unit, that the ladies, when they had to go do whatever they had to do, had to go down to the bathroom for the whole floor. But this is a classic case where a full service lease might apply, right? And the tenants are sharing the common area expenses in something like this, quite often an office park like that. Okay. And then an oil or mineral lease. We talked about there are 3 potential owners of any given property, one for subsurface rights, one for surface rights, and one for the air rights. And this is subsurface rights. When we lease them, not sell them. Because a lot of land in Texas, for instance, let's see, might be like a farmhouse on 100 acres, and they let some oil company come in and put one of those on it. And that oil company is paying them rent for being allowed to pull the resources up out of the ground using one of these devices. Might be a little more fancy and be a bigger one than that. But oil leases or mineral rights to dig for mineral, oil, gas, minerals, all or any of those things could involve a ground lease. I'm sorry, no, an oil or mineral lease. So the owner's receiving cash for giving exploration rights. They received cash, and now they're going to go look and see what they've got. And if they can find oil or minerals, the owner gets a portion of their value as a royalty over time. They need to be in writing to be enforceable as usual. But that's what we're looking for, those subsurface lease rights. What is a lease? Whether it's residential or commercial or any of those other kinds, it's going to have basic provisions. When we get to the contract for sale chapter after this, definitely tomorrow, maybe tonight, but probably not till tomorrow, we're going to see a lot of these same terms, because all of it goes back to contract law. And so what do we need to make a valid lease? We need to have mutual agreement. What does the landlord and tenant want to do? They both want the tenant to be there for X number of amount of time. Week to week, month to month, year to year, 12 months, 6 months, multiple years. They need a valid lease needs to have some sort of an item of value or consideration. What are you giving in exchange for the right to possess? The parties, both landlord and tenant, need to be of legal capacity to enter into a contract. Doesn't mean that they can't enter into a contract if they're not 18, but there's other issues that come up if that is the case. But in general, for both parties to have equal rights to back out, but have consequences for backing out, both parties can rest comfortable knowing, well, the other guy's probably not going to back out because he's got these consequences over his head. Then legal capacity to contract needs to be in place. They need to be 18, sane, and sober at the time they sign the lease. And then it's got to be for a legal objective. We're going to see this again with sales contracts, but the idea here is if you had to go into court to plead your case because the other party is not doing the right thing, the judge is probably not going to listen to you if you say, I'm mad. The landlord is trying to kick me out early because I'm renting the meth house in the middle of the marijuana field and they're not giving me time for my harvest. Well, the judge is going to say, I can't help you with this. This is unenforceable. It wasn't for a legal objective. This is not a valid lease. And oh, by the way, talk to the bailiff on the way out. We have another issue, right? You may not be going home today. So essential provisions of a valid lease, these 4 things, which are the same things as when we run into a contract for sale, giving you a heads up. So we're going to see with that in a little while. Major lease provisions. What would you put in a lease? Before I show that for too long, you tell me in the chat or unmute. What sort of thing would you want to put in a lease if it was your property you're going to rent to someone else?
Period of time.
Definitely, for sure. What else? What if it's for commercial purposes? Oh, go ahead. What you got, Alfred?
Cost.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The rental amount, the amount of time you get to be there. Let's expand into it's a commercial lease. You're going to operate a business out of there. Now, what are you worried about? You ever driven by like an office park and you see through the windows that there's absolutely nothing inside of it? There's no walls. There's no flooring. It's just concrete floor and no separation. It is raw. Thoughts?
Renovation costs.
Yeah. The word for commercial is upfitting. So one thing is, hey, call the number on the sign. I think the space is right, but there's nothing in there. What will you provide, landlord, for upfitting? Will you go ahead and frame out enough space for 4 offices and a lobby and maybe a kitchen? All of that's on the table. When it comes to commercial leases, upfitting improvements is a part of the process. Also might be somebody have something else. I heard air, but no words because I kept interrupting you. What else comes to mind for major provisions you'd want to have in writing in this lease between you and your tenant?
Some sort of like advertising regulations.
Like what they could do, or what do you mean?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, what they would be able to do with the space.
Oh, okay. Back to commercial use. Yeah. There you go. That too. Yeah. What they could do, what they can't do. Can they? So, we go to a coffee shop a lot in Harrisburg and they're having a 20th anniversary. And so they had a banner made and they have like, the coffee shop is on the street corner and then they've got a little like covered pergola. People can sit under the shade outside and they put the banner on that closer to the street. And within about a day, somebody from the city, the town hall, because it's a little town of Harrisburg, which is right down the street, which is probably why they saw it so fast. They, of course, walked in the door and said, go speak to the owner. You can't have your banner right there. It can be on the building, but it can't be on the pergola. It got to be back off the street. It's like, okay, we get it. You have power, whatever. So those sorts of things. Yeah. Covenants, restrictions, sign restrictions. It could be what happens with fixtures. Can you, what do you own? What do we own? What are you bringing as a tenant? It could be, oh, you want to paint cars with this business? Well, then what are you going to do with the paint that doesn't land on the car? What kind of environmental concerns do we have? Are you going to properly dispose of or let it dump into the grass or into the yard? Obviously, that wouldn't be cool. So what are they doing with it? Very specifically, what sorts of repairs are allowed for? What is the tenant responsible for fixing versus what is the landlord responsible? Every light bulb you're going to call the landlord and expect them to come change, or maybe up to $50, it's the tenant's problem. Maybe the tenant puts in light bulbs, or maybe the tenant has to replace the air filter in the heating and air system. All that sort of thing is what we're talking about. Some of those will be minor provisions. Some of them will be major. So when it's commercial property, it's, hey, landlord, I need you to make this. Put this kind of carpet, this color. That last tenant trashed the place. If you want me to rent from you, I'm going to need brand new carpet. And oh, by the way, that was a laundromat. I'm going to use it for an attorney's office. We need to get rid of some things, right? We need this to be a conference room and a.
What about parking?
What was that?
What about parking lot? Parking decks?
For sure. Oh, yeah. How many spaces are allotted for you, right? Is this an office complex or is this a industrial area, and therefore the parking is a lot less, right? When it's not something where we're expecting a lot of traffic from customers, then that's a whole different ballgame. Probably not going to work to put in a hair salon in an industrial area that only has like 5 parking spaces allowed for a given area, especially if you have 20 sinks, right? 20 stations. So all that sort of thing is what we're talking about and more. Repairs, tenants are usually required to make ordinary repairs or be held liable for what's called wasting the property. They also universally have to give the property or leave the property basically in the same condition as when they got it, allowing for ordinary wear and tear. That's a common phrase, ordinary wear and tear. When it comes to the upfits, mostly in commercial, again, that initial customization of the lease space for a brand new tenant, they could specify and say, I need this and this and this. And the landlord might say, after, say, you've been there 10 years, hey, landlord, this building's kind of showing its age a little bit. My space here is kind of getting dingy. I'd like for you to put in new carpet. Give me an upfitting improvement if you want me to sign the lease renewal to go another 5-10 years. Or I could look at the one down the street that's a whole brand new building, right? So landlord might offer incentives like, let's modernize an upfit package to keep that tenant sticking around. Maybe the tenant outgrows the property and they don't need it anymore. They want to go to a bigger space and they can't just tack on to the side, right? They're blocked in with other businesses, so they just need out. But instead of getting out of the lease altogether, they have the right to sublet it to someone else or assign the lease to somebody else. In other words, let someone else take over. The landlord doesn't want them to just have the ability to get out and walk away, because then they're doing the landlord out of what they had agreed to. Maybe it's a 3-year lease. That was exactly my situation when I left my second real estate firm. The broker he got kind of weird, and he was insulting and abusive to some of the female brokers. He would compliment and make weird compliments about their dress and attire, and then he made me promises and didn't fulfill them on the business side of things. And fast forward like 5 years, one of my colleagues from that experience, she texted me a link to the Mecklenburg County Police blotter, and this same guy was busted for peeping in his neighbor's bathroom window when he was walking the dog at nighttime. So we were all right. We learned what a creep, and we left. And sure enough, it came out later that, yeah, indeed he was. But I left there because of him and his stuff. And so I was just kind of hurt. I was like, ugh, I'll show him. I'll just lease space in this same office complex. Not really taking time to think, wait a minute, do I really need space? Don't I meet people at Starbucks, showing property at their houses? I didn't really need it. But in my naivete, I signed a 3-year lease for like a 900 foot, maybe 600 foot office space. I didn't need it. And I got to the point where it was just kind of costing me money that I wasn't even justifying. So my neighbor was a CPA, Satchapal Puri, really nice older guy. And he always would say, it is what it is, when anything came up. But he needed more space. I didn't need it anymore. I didn't want to be there anymore. He agreed to sublet from me with a year to go. So while I was paying X dollars a month up to that point, I was able to I didn't get rid of the monthly payment, but I turned it from $900 a month down to $100 a month. And so he sublet it. I could have also assigned it to him, right? If the landlord would have allowed it. But those are some major provisions. Well, do they even let you? They may not. So the term of the lease, we talked about that. Can you renew it? What happens if you don't pay? The default and the penalty for not paying and not maintaining your lease. It might be a penalty of a certain percentage of the lease amount added to your next bill. Maybe that you like it. Maybe it's a rental house, like a mill house, and you like the area, and you've been there long enough that you have a clientele locally, and it's important to have local business. So you negotiate an option to buy it. You say, hey, landlord, I don't want to really buy it, but I also don't want any other landlord than you. So one option might be, hey, landlord, if you ever think about selling, you'll give me the first chance to buy it. You won't sell it to someone else without asking me if I want to do it. So you could have it in writing that they have to give you this first right of refusal. You could also have it in writing to have an option to purchase it. Either because somebody else comes along and says, hey, I want to buy it, and that landlord can't sell it to them without asking you if you want to buy it, or the landlord has decided I want to sell it. There's nobody making them an offer yet, but the landlord says, I'm ready to get rid of it. Again, they have to come to you first. So that all could be in there too. And then think about from the perspective of the landlord, do you want, or do you have the right to come in and check on the property from time to time? Would you want that? Tell me in the chat. Because if you don't come in and check from time to time, you might just discover that the power bill has gone up significantly, and it's because they are using it in a whole different way than what you were informed, right? You want to check on things. You also want to check. I would just go in to check, and I would always want to change the air filters myself. The heating and air system, right? Because even if it's the tenant's agreed duty to do it for you, I'm not going to trust that they do it on time. I'm going to want to make sure it gets done. Also, smoke detectors. Let's make sure those keep working. I don't want anybody dying because the smoke detector was chirping at 2 a.m. and they took the battery out. So all that comes into play, and that would be in the lease too. The landlord's right to enter. How often? You can't just drop in unannounced by law. You have to give them some notice, but having that spelled out in the lease, the covenant of quiet enjoyment, they get to stay there and occupy it without worrying about somebody just dropping in. How do we end the lease? What are the situations and conditions for ending the lease? Well, the parties could agree. If both parties mutually agree to terminate it, that ends the lease. Most frequently, it's because the lease term expired. We went the entire 12 months or 6 months or whatever was agreed upon, and now it's done. That ends the lease. Also, operation of law, because maybe the seller owner went bankrupt, or the property was such bad shape it had to be condemned, or somebody on one side or the other breaches their end of the deal. They breach their provisions. They breach the contract. All of these things of how a lease can terminate are also, well, most of them, not all of them, but many of them are the way a contract for sale can be terminated. So again, we'll see that in the future. The essential elements for a lease are a lot like essential elements for a contract for sale, because a lease is a version of a contract, but it's just between the owner and the owner and the renter. Okay. There's a legal term called the statute of frauds. Statute of frauds says in order to be enforceable, something must be in writing. A contract for buying something must be in writing to be enforceable. Enforceable, what does that mean? If you have to sue somebody and take them to court because they tried to back out of a contract, they agreed to sell the property to you, is the judge going to ask to see this in writing? Yeah. Or is the judge going to say, hey, can I see it? And you're going to say, well, we shook hands on it. We didn't write it down because we're friends. Get out of my courtroom. It's not enforceable unless it's in writing. So the statute of frauds says certain documents have to be in writing in order to be enforceable. So this is a weird one. We touched on it, I think, back when we were talking about deeds or something. If it's a lease that's 3 years or less, there are some built-in protections that keeps the tenant from getting kicked out. For instance, if the landlord sells to someone else. You can't just kick out your tenant. You have to honor the lease. Even in residential, if I see a rental property for sale, I'll look at the listing and it'll say, maybe it's been on the market for a while and I wonder what's wrong with it. Hadn't sold in a week. In this market, it should have sold. And it's because it's a rental and the tenants are still there. And a lot of times the instructions say, hey, don't bother the tenants. Occasionally it says no showings until we're under contract. They don't even want to bother the tenant and let you see inside until you agree to buy it, which I can't imagine. But when you agree to buy a property that has tenants in place, you have to honor the leases that are in place. So, different if the leases are 3 years, are more than 3 years. Not 3 years or more, but if it's a lease over 3 years, it needs to be in writing for sure to be enforceable. Because in this case, you could have a situation where the landlord sells to someone else, and if it's a lease for more than 3 years, the tenant could get kicked out by the new owner. Unless it's in writing and recorded. So 2 things. Statute of frauds says must be in writing to be enforceable. So leases over 3 years need to be in writing to be enforceable to protect that tenant. In writing, signed by landlord, signed by tenant. Again, for more than 3 years from the date of execution in order to comply with the statute of frauds of North Carolina. On the test, the testable thing is more than 3 years, not 3 years or more. I guarantee they would quite likely give you an answer choice that is 3-year lease. In that case, no, this doesn't apply. A 3-year or less lease has built-in protections for the tenant. If it's a more than 3-year lease, then it doesn't have built-in protections and it needs to be in writing to be enforceable so the tenant can't get booted by the new owner. Also, leases longer than 3 years need to be recorded, not only in writing, but recorded. Again, the same situation. So the main thing here that we'll see in contracts for sale show up here. The statute of frauds says a document has to be in writing to be enforceable. The Connor Act is another legal act that says you have to record a document to protect against third-party claims. Someone coming along saying, hey, I'm a co-owner. So the statute of frauds is one thing. The Connor Act is another thing. Don't mix them up. Even if you write it 10 times on a piece of paper to get the difference. Statute of frauds. Right, in writing to be enforceable. Let's see. We're about halfway through this chapter, so we're going to finish this up tomorrow, and then we'll get on into contracts. So be looking for that, and I'll see you back here in 24 hours. Well, no, 20 hours. See you there tomorrow. Have a good night.